Welcome to the TMRN Time Monk Radio Network. I'm Jules, and today is Saturday, the 6th of August 2011. Today we have Catherine Austin Fitts, former US Assistant Secretary of Housing and author of the weekly Solari Report, which strives to build personal and family wealth in changing times, which we sure have at the moment. Her website is solari.com. Hello, Catherine, and welcome to the WebBot Forum Roundtable.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you. The WebBot Forum administrator is Fox, and today he'll be doing the recording and technical support of the show. Several members of the forum were kind enough to join us tonight. They include members Diane B., Green Meadow, Groundrod, McLaren, Plain, and Vito. For listeners, this interview will assume you have a fairly good understanding of Catherine's work, including her numerous interviews with Coast to Coast and other interviews available on YouTube. Catherine's expertise goes beyond simple economics. Again, Catherine's website is solari.com. This interview will be available on YouTube for free on the WebBot Forum channel and at the website webbotforum.com. Are you ready for the interview, Catherine?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Considering the recent events with the 500-point plus drop on Thursday on the Dow and also the downgrade by S&P of the US debt from AAA to AA+, we'd like to start off with some questions in that regard. McLaren,
Sure.
You got a question?
Yes, Catherine, in recent days, there has been a number of significant dislocations in the global markets. This ranges from the Italian debt market, broader European bonds, and EFSF, and Germany being unable to fund the rescue of broader Southern Europe and the pan-European periphery. Additionally, as Jules had indicated, we've had the hard descent or correction in the global equity markets, and adding to that was Friday's downgrade by S&P of the U.S. bond or credit rating. What are your current impressions of the currency, debt, equity, and commodity markets? Do you have any thoughts of what may transpire over the coming month? And does this in any way adjust your thoughts on a larger crash or the slow burn?
Excellent question. I see the financial system, particularly the bond and debt system, to be not a financial market, but increasingly a governance system. What you have is you have a group of, you want to call them there are many different names, but private players. I think Cliff calls them the powers that be. And they're simply using the ability to get governments dependent on the sovereign debt market and on debt to basically run government through its absence of financial sovereignty. If you can cause a sovereign government to lose its information sovereignty, which is a matter of digital and other forms of surveillance, and then lose its financial sovereignty, you can control, a very few small group of people can control from behind the scenes and in essence re-engineer government. And what we've watched since the institution of the WTO in the mid-90s is a process whereby, and it happens differently, but it's sort of a rolling collapse or a rolling entrapment, is place after place watch both assets and governmental powers shift out of sovereign governments and into private corporations and private investors. And we're simply watching, it started in the third world and second world countries, and now what we're watching is it move into Europe and into the United States. So, I call it a financial coup d'etat, but in essence what we're doing is we're re-engineering the governance and management system, if you will, on planet Earth, and it's being worked through the financial system. And in some respects, it looks like a crisis, but I don't think it really is. It's a process. It's ongoing. And of course, for those of us who are affected adversely by it, who haven't sort of seen it coming, haven't planned for it, it can be very unnerving. But my vision of it is it's much more a managed process. Now, it emerges organically, so it's managed within frames and sort of day-to-day. In the short term, things are quite organic. So to a certain extent, the powers that be are prototyping just, like some of us are. But I think what we're doing is we're going through that process, and it's defined by a couple of themes. One is the idea of assets moving out of government into private hands while liabilities are being shifted back into government. So that's sort of the, what some people call privatization. I call it piratisation. That's what we're seeing, for example, in Greece. But we've seen it for decades now around the world. It's been going on for quite a while. The second thing is part of that reset occurs by a process of really entrapment and harvesting using both fiat currency and sovereign debt and debt in general. So the housing bubble was an example. But you get a country sort of dependent, over leveraged, then you pull the rug, then you pick up assets cheap. It's what Naomi Klein calls disaster capitalism. And it's been unbelievably effective. And part of what has evolved out of that, of course, is if you're printing lots of paper, if the insiders can print lots and lots of fiat currency and lots of bonds, including fraudulent bonds sort of created covertly, they can debase the currency. And so one of the things that's happening is tremendous debasement of paper money. And so we're also going through a reset between the flood of paper that's been issued and real things. So, for example, we're seeing the prices of tangibles go up steadily, and the way that most people track that is by tracking the price of gold and silver and other precious metals. But in essence, what we've seen is more than literally since the early 2000s, over the last decade, we've seen a 400% rise in the price. Well, that's not a rise in the price of gold or silver. That's a fall in the value of fiat currency. And so we're going through this reset between financial paper and real things. And in the process of that happening, there's a third theme that I want to underscore, and that is consistently the value of financial assets for the insiders are being propped up with various forms of subsidy, and that rather than set off hyperinflation, the hyperinflation is being offset by devaluing labor. So we're literally seeing government subsidy consistently go to capital and be paid for by extracting the value from labor. And a lot of that works very invisibly and very sort of sneakily through the financial system. So I would say what we're watching is sort of an ongoing financial coup d'etat that really, in my mind, started in 1995 and is really being used to centralize governance on planet Earth. And so it's really not a financial crisis in the true sense, because we're looking at an economy that's defined not by economic optimization, as a market economy might be, but optimization for the benefit of a few players within very strict lines of what technology is permitted and what technology is not, and what the rules of the game are. And as a result, they're centralizing power in a way that shrinks the economy, and it creates tremendous poverty and reduces total, sort of equity value on planet Earth. But it centralizes control. And so to me, the goal is clearly not to maximize wealth. The goal is simply to concentrate power and control.
Wow.
So there it is, financial coup d'etat.
Yeah, not exactly the most wonderful thing for the majority of the globe's populations. Thank you very much for... I just want to really say, because this is, I've spent a lifetime trying to, I'm a person, I'll just call the people centralizing power, I call him Mr. Global. And I spent a lifetime kind of watching Mr. Global operate and trying to persuade everyone else to pay attention and protect themselves. And the first step to real solutions is transparency. And so, I'm almost glad Mr. Global's coming out of the closet, because for the first time in my lifetime, I'm starting to see people realize, there really is a force that's centralizing, and it really is that adverse to, all life. And I have a pastor who used to say, if we can face it, God can fix it. But I think if we can face it, then the collective intelligence can go to work on it. Because nothing, things, certainly economically, we don't have an economic problem. If we just simply said, okay, we're going to run everything to optimize total wealth, the wealth that could be created on this planet is just mind-boggling. And it would be nice if No, it'd be very nice if that could happen, Catherine. No doubt about it. Thanks for that clarity. Something that some of us are curious about would extend over into the derivatives sphere. Do you see the current events shaking loose and destroying or sending those into a broader shockwave of dislocation?
Well, let's assume that there are two possibilities, because Mr. Global has the ability to engineer that or not as he wishes. So, my vision of what's possible centrally is quite, I have a vision of central control quite amazing. But let's say he doesn't, and Mr. Global just lets a market economy work. The generally Standard and Poor. Okay, so let me step back and look at the game for a second. What just happened in the last 6 weeks is we ran a little game, and what Mr. Global did, because the Tea Party movement at this point is quite engineered centrally, what Mr. Global did was he got the Tea Party to basically take the position that, number one, Mr. Global shouldn't have to pay more in taxes, and two, the American people should be held accountable for the whole pie, even when their participation is only a half pie, and number one. And then number two, S&P comes out and basically says, okay, Mr. Global can extract higher profit margins for lending back to the country the money that Mr. Global has been gifted through the bailouts and missing money. So it's a squeeze play, and it's a brilliantly designed and brilliantly executed squeeze play to basically allow Mr. Global, despite the recession and everything that's going on, basically engineer another round of incredible debasement and sort of harvesting of particularly the U.S. and the global economy. So it's really what you're watching in the game of economic warfare is something that will dramatically increase Mr. Global's profits and control in this kind of situation. Now, what's going to happen Monday? If you look at similar situations to this, for example, when Japan was downgraded, this should not make a big difference. There should be, an increase in the debt or in the interest expense, but it should probably not be anywhere near catastrophic, with one possible exception. Throughout the United States, there's all sorts of trusts and agreements and other legal documents that stipulate government agencies and or AAA securities. And if we get enough mess in those legal covenants and it relates enough to leverage derivatives, then we could get a real problem. Now, it's a problem that the U.S. government has the power to fix, because I assure you there is, if you look at the basis of S&P's rating of the United States government for the last 30 years, there's absolutely no reason for them to downgrade based on actual financial credit issues whatsoever. And if there was a basis, they should have done it 20 years ago or certainly 10 years ago, not now. So the timing of this and the logic behind it is quite, I would say, quite suspect. And I say that as somebody who's worked very, very closely with them. So this could have, this could rock the boat on a temporary basis. Could it lead to something catastrophic? I think only if Mr. Global wants it to. A AA plus is still an extraordinarily high rating, and S&P says, it's on negative watch for 2 years from now. So this does not have to, for people holding big positions on long bonds, they're going to get debased hard the way they have been for years. So the biggest holder is not the Chinese or the Saudis. The biggest holder is U.S. pension funds. So, the average American, Main Street, just really had it sucked to them again. So on a debasement, this is serious, but if you look at what should happen in the financial markets, it doesn't really have to rock and roll unless Mr. Global wants it to. Now, here is what is the case, and that is we're watching a profound shift in consciousness, because there have been so many people who have been praying that the current paradigm could keep going. Now, 2008 sort of threw some of them off the consciousness Titanic. Those who didn't get thrown off of the consciousness Titanic, this will certainly rock them. The other thing it will do is it will create a real national security question mark, which is much more dangerous than what it might do in the financial markets, and that is, this is a signal that Mr. Global may think he's got enough money in his endowments to finance a global military without the United States federal budget. And if anybody gives that theory serious pause, then you're talking about basically, showing your jugular to the rest of the world with lots of people who, for good reason or not, would love to take a whack at us. So, it's going to be very interesting to see what the response is. But from a financial standpoint, the United States is still, has the strength of a AAA.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Catherine. Jules?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. In regards to what you just mentioned about profound shift in consciousness, Cliff has had linguistic data for a long time on the rise of the refuseniks and the Second American Revolution. There seems to be a clear disconnect between Wall Street and the US economy, and it seems to be widening. And also in the last report, Cliff talks about the greatest wealth transfer in history. With the Arab Spring and various protests, including the ones happening now in London, which became violent, unfortunately, and 250,000 people marching in Israel, based on your experience working in your Solari circles, and because of your popularity, many people obviously talk to you, what is your opinion of the Second American Revolution, and what do you think people should do and not do?
Oh, that's a big one. Well, let me just ask you, what do you mean by the Second American Revolution?
What I mean by that is the widening gap between rich and poor causing the poor to revolt.
I think right now, over the last 30 years, the United States government has done an absolutely amazing job of creating tremendous dependency of every household and then every county and municipality on federal government money. So if you come into, America breaks down into 3,100 counties, and the financial dependency of individual people is extraordinary, and the poorer they are, the more financially dependent they are. And as a result, you have tended to see very sort of little revolution because, in fact, what you have is extraordinary financial dependency, whether it's on food stamps or housing subsidies or all sorts of job programs. It's quite extraordinary, and it's very not understood. There's tremendous absence of understanding about this particular situation. That's number one. The second thing is, if you look at the entrainment and subliminal programming on the media and possibly other means, what you're seeing is extraordinary mind control backed up with extraordinary manipulation within individual and personal networks. And so if you look at the extent to which America is on mental and financial lockdown, it's quite extraordinary. And so it's very hard for me to fathom exactly how we would see a revolution, which is why I think to a certain extent it's so important that we have a revolution of consciousness. The other thing is you cannot underestimate enough the extent to which the average American on Main Street is complicit in the corruption. So, for example, if you look at the bankruptcy of America, probably the greatest contributing factor was the strong dollar policy, and the key legs of the strong dollar policy, the most important one was the sort of entrapment of most Americans through debt, whether it was the housing bubble, student loan debt, which is arguably the most ugly and vicious. And if you look at that entrapment process, it depended, it wasn't something just done by the top guys. It was done by thousands and thousands of individuals, in every county in America. So the housing bubble was engineered by mortgage brokers and realtors and appraisers. Everybody was making money on it. And so there's a cleansing. Before you can have a resolution, people have to come clean in their own minds and hearts and pocketbooks. And that's the hardest part, not that the powers that be want to centralize, but at this point, so many people have been guilty of basically bankrupting America to help them. So that creates a situation which is much more, it's a little bit like saltwater taffy on the ground to get real change coming. Now, where is real change happening? If you look back and you see where have the powers that be have gotten absolutely stopped dead in their tracks, the answer is homeschooling. When it comes to people's children, they draw a line in the sand and they're willing to risk life and limb and pocketbook to protect their children. And so literally the powers that be, Mr. Global has gotten stopped dead on controlling education, and homeschooling is growing. The second place, hopefully, and the most critical to the economy is food freedom. So the right to eat, healthy food, organic food, raw food, the right for a farmer to sell to his neighbor without government regulation or interference. If we can draw the line in the sand and protect food freedom the way we have homeschooling, that's the basis of a real revolution, because it's a revolution that will be profitable. I live in Tennessee. If you go through Tennessee, thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs have been destroyed over the last 2 decades by rules that have literally made it impossible for small farmers, particularly dairy farmers, to function. You delete those rules, oh my God, you really turn things around. And then finally, there's all sorts of things you can do with local currency and local equity investment that if you stopped the powers that be from stopping that, if you just could get it going on a local basis, there's really the basis of turning things around. So when it comes down to a line in the sand, I think if we can draw a line on the sand in food freedom and circulating currency and equity locally, then we've got a real shot at a revolution. But it's going to take not rioting, which goes the other way, which is why the powers that be do so much to engineer riots. But it's going to take people really voting with their time and their money and their transactions and investments. So a revolution is possible, but it's going to have to deal with the money, and it may have to ultimately deal with taxes. And we have not seen any real indication yet on the ground that people are prepared to do that. And I think a lot of what the tactics have been are to prevent that from gathering and happening. Now, there's one sort of very hopeful sign I wanted to mention, and that is, and I think Cliff High and the WebBot had a major contribution in helping make that happen, and that was the pushback on the swine flu vaccination. The effort at mandatory vaccination got stopped dead in its tracks, and that was an American revolution. And it's if you kind of look under the cover and see how that happened, wasn't food freedom, but it was health freedom. And and that was a very optimistic sign, and you could see how frustrated and how dangerous Mr. Global could be when it gets stopped by that. So I think the solutions, the revolution on the ground has to come from a vision of a model. I said before that the economy is shrinking, but it's a political problem, not an economic problem. You have to have a vision on the ground and leadership that can envision not just a way to have a revolution, but have a way to have a highly profitable revolution, because that's what we need to do. We need to decentralize political power in a way that creates wealth, because the problem with what Mr. Global's doing is it's shrinking wealth, and it's basically throwing people overboard. So we have the good ship income, and people are being thrown overboard, which means we've got to reorganize in a way that will build small business, build enterprise, build income, build far more productivity on the ground than we have now. So there it is. That's that's a long answer, but that was a big question.
Yeah, I agree. That's why I intimated at the start, what should we not and not do? Definitely we should not go down the violent path. I mean, that's probably playing into their hands.
Yeah, absolutely.
In regards to political, and this is a political problem, not an economic problem, interestingly, the US debt ceiling was raised this week, but the global market still sold off, mainly because Europe is on the brink of collapse due to sovereign debt. There is currently a debate on whether there will be hyperinflation or deflation. Mike Rupert suggests resource constraints are now hindering the model of unlimited growth perception, which has been at the heart of current capitalist thinking. Firstly, what do you think of Mike Rupert's theory? And if Mike's theory is correct, wouldn't it stand to reason that limited resources would cause massive hyperinflation and even food shortages, fuel restrictions, and currency wars?
I think the idea of a global collapse is a bunch of bunk. Not to say that it can't happen or be engineered, but there's absolutely no reason for it to happen. If you look at, the resources we have available on planet Earth and the technology that we have, in theory, there's a way, for us to all live well together. But that's going to require literally civilization to advance significantly. What we have had on planet Earth for 500 years is something, sort of a model I call central banking warfare. The central banks print money, and then the folks with the guns make people take it and get natural resources in exchange for cheap, and then the value of the paper goes down. It's a global taxation system through the balance sheet. And the central banking warfare model has depended on enormous amounts of violence, both overt and covert. And it's a very, very primitive model. Now, it's very old, it's very deep. So getting 6 billion people out of a primitive model and into a civilized model is, that's not, I don't underestimate the challenge of that. But as an economic matter, if you look at the current economy optimizes within politically set barriers, or boundaries, and one of those boundaries is the rules and regulations. So for example, in the United States, rules and regulations basically make sure that corporations can consolidate market share and control of agriculture, and basically wipe out a lot of small businesses that are much more economic. So, we're not talking about an economic process, we're talking about a political. So one is rules and regulations, but the second is technology. If you look at the technology which exists versus the technology that's been allowed to be applied in healthcare, in energy, how many times have we solved cancer? Probably hundreds. And yet most people don't know that. So the boundaries that we're optimizing within are false boundaries. If you just said, okay, we're going to let whatever technology exists be free to develop and grow, it would be a very different world. Now, the problem is it'd be much more decentralized, and so, Mr. Global is afraid of that kind of out-of-control process. But the idea that, there's no doubt that on this planet, as population grows, we have a peak everything in terms of finite resources. However, if you look at the technology that we've kept out of the, in the closet or suppressed, there's no reason to think that economic collapse has to occur for material reasons, as far as I can tell. So, I don't disagree that we need to stop. Our current model doesn't work in this sense. If you look at the current corporate model, for investors to make capital gains on their investment, they need for consumption to go up. But that's because they're investing equity within a functional enterprise. If we financed our places, so if we financed a county or a state with equity, then people would make money on that place reducing consumption. So the notion that consumption is necessary to keep a capitalist model going is complete bunk. It's just not true. It's a complete lie. If we finance places with equity, then in fact, investors could make a fortune on reducing consumption and healing the environment. So if that's not happening, it's because clearly, again, that's going to be more decentralizing. I'm presuming that at some point Mr. Global is going to want to do that before he introduces new technology, because that's how he optimizes the profit he makes on it. But the notion that we have to have collapse, or that we have to have, that capitalism or the economy needs more consumption, it's just not true. It's just not true.
Catherine, no big picture question here, but I was curious from your first interview with Cliff, You stated, when I was on Wall Street, I worked with an insurance company that was doing research on whether or not memories come from the future. Could you elaborate on this statement and or tell us what they found?
I have no idea. I was at a meeting of an organization that sort of brings together people from different financial institutions, and it was a very capable young researcher who worked for, it was a Scandinavian insurance company, and he started telling me about the research that he was doing, and I never followed up. So I really don't know, but what was interesting is it was clear to me that they took it quite seriously. So, and I thought it was fascinating.
Yes.
But I really can't tell you much more than that.
Well, I thought I'd ask because it was interesting to me too, considering we're the WebBot forum here. Well, okay, I'm going to move on to what just about every one of us had a question on, which is the slow burn. And what we got here next is I've maintained for years now that your slow burn scenario would continue to be correct up until the day it wasn't anymore. As a longtime subscriber to Half Past Human Reports, what is your current opinion of Cliff's work?
I have a very high opinion of Cliff's work. I think there's nothing, more useful than kind of mapping out. It's what I call, one of my favorite writers is a guy named Michael Ventura, and he called it the psychic storm. And I think Cliff is mapping out a lot of what people are thinking and hoping and concerned about, and that's invaluable information. Now, I also feel that of course, people don't have a good understanding of how things work now, the way they work. And in fact, we have, one of the debates, somebody just posted a question up on the Solera report saying, Cliff High was adamant that you were wrong about the slow burn and the dollar was going to collapse shortly, and have you extracted an apology from him? But there's always been this debate, and I've always believed that collapse is not a global shared phenomena, as a lot of people have thought it would be. We've seen enormous amounts of collapse over the last 20 years, but they've been sort of managed and isolated. So Argentina is collapsing, or Russia's collapsing, or New Orleans is collapsing, but it's not a global shared experience. It's kind of sequential and managed. So there's plenty of collapse going on. It's just a different kind of collapse. And I think when I read sort of what Cliff aggregates and writes with Half Past Human, my sense is it represents an extraordinary ignorance in the sort of body politic about how the current financial system has worked in the past and works now, and hopefully, I'm hoping that will change. But so I think his work is invaluable, and I think the reading he's getting is quite sincere. But I've always felt that he was mapping out, people's feelings based on their common understanding of, sort of their official reality about how the financial system works, as opposed to how I think it really works. But I should say, I agree with you. It's if slow burn continues, or let me say it this way: the people who run the plan and have the power to slow burn this thing the whole way. Because what you're doing is you're subsidizing capital and offsetting that by devaluing and extracting subsidy from labor. And you can continue that process ad infinitum as long as you're willing to depopulate or kill enough people. I mean, that's, kind of what war is. It's the ultimate deflation. And so they have the power to slow burn this thing the whole way. And in my mind, there's no economic reason why they can't. The reality is, do they want to, number one? But number two, it's a big plan and it takes a lot of coordination. And I think at some point, the sort of evilness of what's going on makes it hard to keep the slow burn together. The politics of just the leadership managing is extremely difficult. So there are many scenarios where the slow burn doesn't continue. And I agree, in theory it could work until it works, and then boom, suddenly it doesn't work. And I think, day to day, I'm an investment advisor, and one of the most important questions I ask myself constantly every day throughout the day is, what are the probabilities of a slow burn continuing this year versus another 2008 versus collapse? And my feeling for my clients is it's impossible to know what the future brings. If anything, the future should be invented, not predicted. But, I like them to organize their affairs so that they're going to be successful no matter which scenario it is. And I think they have to be prepared, even though I don't think there's a big chance of a global collapse. I do think there's a chance, but I also think that collapse for any one of us, could come for a variety of different reasons, including weather and space phenomena where we are. So we need to be prepared for it. So I think the WebBot project on this topic is invaluable. And what I would love to see, both with Cliff and many others of us who talk about different scenarios, is why so often, various folks have predicted that the dollar would collapse and it hasn't. And I think it's by looking into that phenomena that I've really come to believe and understand a slow burn. And one reason was, I thought that there was profound reasons for collapse in the late 90s because I'd had a chance to look deeply into the black budget. But one of the things I had the personal opportunity to do just because of my own personal experiences really experience the phenomenal centralized control of digital communications and technology, and consequently just the astounding control that the folks who run the centralized team have of individuals and counties and communities. It's quite remarkable. I mean, the extent of the invisible surveillance and digital control and influence is just far greater than most people realize. There really is a matrix.
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm not sure I have much faith in binary money, but that's an excellent answer. Thank you very much.
Hi, Catherine. This is Green Meadow.
Hi.
Partially answered this question already. I want to thank you for your slow burn explanation about what's really going on with the economy. Of all the prognosticators that we've had, the slow burn seems to be the most accurate theory, and that's been very useful. But now I'm wondering, as the slow burn plays out, what's the end game? Where are we going?
Well, the logical there are a couple places the end game can go, or let's just look at this economically. There are three things you can do. You can the slow burn can continue forever if, one, you integrate new technology, so new energy and healthcare technology. Two, you depopulate significantly. Or three, you transform the economic and investment model, or a combination of the three. So if you look, for example, at the technology that I believe to be existent but not integrated, you could radically reduce the cost of energy on planet Earth, and you could radically reduce the cost of health care, certainly in the United States and in Europe. So that's number one. Number two, of course, is depopulation. That's obvious. The third is if we change the economic model. I talked last night about the fact that the theory that we need more consumption to keep capitalism going is a complete bunch of hooey. If we financed places with equity, people could make huge and hideous capital gains, reducing consumption and integrating new technology. So if you literally change the investment model, I'm happy to go into it in great detail, but if you change the investment model, you can absolutely re-optimize the economy in many respects and build an economic model where people have tremendous incentive to behave in environmentally responsive ways. I mean, peace can make a lot more money than war. So there are a couple ways to get there now. If you look at the trajectory they're on, I can only assume what they're doing is using they're planning on depopulation. So, because if you're Mr. Global and you're running this thing, the simplest way to do it is to depopulate. I mean, that's the least risky strategy from your standpoint, though. Integrating new technology is more tricky. Now, one of my theories, and it's only a theory, but it's the only logical explanation I can come up with, is if you look at the politics of trying to patent life and to control the seed and food supply and introduce GMO seeds, if you sort of step back and study that whole phenomena over the last 20 years, my conclusion is that Mr. Global clearly doesn't believe that oil will continue to back the reserve currency, and he needs a replacement. He needs an asset that can back a new global currency, particularly a digital one. And so oil is going to go the way of all flesh, and that's why food has become, and the seed supply and control of the seed supply has become so important, and that's why the press to really get that adopted globally is so ferocious right now. If that's the case, if that theory has any merit, then it looks to me like they may be bringing in that new energy technology, and sooner rather than later. And if that's the case, that's going to reshuffle the whole economic deck, in just incredible ways. I always say, has anybody here seen the documentary Phoenix Lights?
I haven't.
Okay, well, I recommend it to you. It's a documentary made by a doctor in Phoenix who, I guess she filmed it from her balcony. There's this huge spaceship that sort of rolled down the eastern side of Arizona, and it's quite phenomenal. And one of my more famous quotes was a group of luminaries in the financial blogosphere were talking about the dollar was going to crash shortly. This was last year. And finally one of them said, "What do you think?" And I said, "I think the dollar is going to do whatever the guy who owns that spaceship wants it to do." Because I'm a believer that it's the military that holds that sets the value of the dollar. And part of that is through the control of the oil as sort of as the backed asset. But whatever that spaceship was about, I can assure you it wasn't running on fuel that it got at the local ExxonMobil station. So if you look at the technology that appears to be available, the energy technology that appears to be available, in which a number of scientists have attested to, if they start to integrate that, then all bets are off. We're in for pretty radical change. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that does. So to me, it kind of sounds like if the powers that be stay in charge, they're probably headed down the depopulation route, and there's a possibility they'll go down the new technology route if they can control it.
Well, part of their challenge, and I just really encourage you to sit back and put yourself in Mr. Global's shoes for a second. The new technology is so powerful, and our culture, our global culture is so primitive, and our model is so warlike that integrating that technology is very tricky and very dangerous. So the question is, how do you integrate it in a way that you and your syndicates stay in control? And it's quite complicated and quite tricky, and that's part of what I think makes whether it's depopulation or reducing everybody into poverty and having very tight digital control, it makes it the economics say, look, we need this technology, but the politics say, well, we can't have this technology unless we have complete control.
Yeah. So my next question is that in the past you said there was a very small, maybe 5% possibility of global or U.S. financial collapse. And last I heard, you thought the likelihood of collapse had crept up to 25%. What's made that change, if that's still true?
Oh, here are the scenarios. My scenarios for 2011 are three scenarios. One is slow burn. One is 2008 redux, which is a repeat of 2008. Mm-hmm. And then three is collapse. And at the beginning of the year, it was 70% slow burn, 25% 2008, and 5% collapse. And then after Fukushima, I changed it to 65 slow burn, 25 to 30, 2008, and 5% collapse. So collapse didn't change the 2008, because I think that Fukushima is much more potentially devastating in its impact than is perhaps understood.
Thank you. So my next question comes from forum member Gridiron.
Mm-hmm.
If you viewed collapse as a graph and the severity steadily increased, at what point in time, like dates, do you expect this collapse to turn the corner and hit the elbow of the parabolic curve that the severity begins to go vertical?
To me, collapse can happen in two circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
One is if Mr. Global wants it to,
mm-hmm.
and the other is in the event of what I call the Midianite thing. So let me explain the Midianite thing. There's in the Old Testament, there's a story of Gideon being asked by an angel of the Lord to throw the Midianites out of Israel. And so Gideon is a shepherd and very skeptical that he can do this, but he organizes a ragtag militia, and sure enough, they come down the side of the mountains. The Midianites are sleeping in the valley below, and they come down with lights and pitchers making noise and light. And the Midianites are so deeply distrustful and suspicious of each other, they jump up and kill each other in the dark. And I started to use this frame when I started to publish articles in the 90s about some of the financial corruption was going on. And what I noticed was we would publish something saying, there's $59 million missing from HUD. And all of a sudden it would set off squabbles because you realized all these people were getting compensated, not realizing how much money they were helping Mr. Global steal. So they wanted a bigger piece. And so it used to set off these squabbles. So, part of our, a scenario that's positive for all of us is if there's so much squabbling politically in the centralized systems that it sets off fighting, and then you get a, sort of a systematic control. So I think collapse can happen in those two scenarios. Away from that, I just don't see it happening. Now, what I do see happening is sequential collapse. So what you've watched is if I want to come into East Asia, or I want to come into Argentina, or I want to come into Indonesia and buy up a lot of equity, I want to engineer a collapse because then the prices of everything drop dramatically, and then I can buy everything up cheap. And what we've seen around the world is sort of a systematic crashing of a given country or economy, and then Mr. Global coming in and picking things up cheap, and then bringing in lots of government programs and other things that then drives those equity values up. And so you have a sequential collapse pattern, but it's much more a disaster capitalism kind of pattern. So I don't see the hyperbolic collapse scenario because I think I don't agree that material reality necessitates an economic collapse. I just don't think that has to be. Now, if Mr. Global wants complete control and he wants the absence of prosperity, then you could kind of get it. But I don't see the global collapse scenario as a high probability.
Okay. That makes sense. It's not pretty, but it makes sense.
Right. And I'm not saying, the funny thing is that most of the people on this call, certainly our descendants would be better off with a global collapse. And I think, what I've seen over the last decade is again and again and again you have very hardworking, productive, sort of enlightened people hoping for the Big Bang, so the Y2K or the collapse, because right now we're in an Orwellian world where all prices lie, and everything's Orwellian, and up is down and down is up, and nothing makes sense. And so there's this hope, this deep longing that this contrived system will hit the wall, fall apart, and at least then we can go back into a world where, there's some semblance of markets, no matter how wild and out of control. But at least it's an exit from the Orwellian nightmare. And I just think that while emotionally that can be very appealing, you have to be careful, because what I see is all the good-hearted people letting go of, thinking a collapse is coming, so they stop building the future, and meantime Carlyle's running around buying everything, out from under them.
Yeah.
So I would just, I'm not saying collapse can't happen, but I just think we need to be prepared for any one of, a number of possible scenarios. Because I'll tell you, if you look at the most powerful people in the world, they're getting $27 trillion of bailouts and using it to buy up everything. So they're not planning on collapse.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Right. They're planning on buying up everything. While persuade. I mean, here's the game. If I'm Mr. Global, I want you to buy my paper so that I can use your money to buy and control all the real things. Now, if you believe in collapse, you're not running around trying to buy all the real things because you're figuring, well, it's going to collapse. So, that kind of makes it easier for him. So I would be careful about how you think about collapse and how you use it as a scenario. Now, I have to tell you, when you see, I live in a county which has been in a state of collapse for, a long time, and I just drove back from San Francisco and saw town after town, towns that have collapsed. They're just hollowed out. And because that's what debasement does. It and the slow burn does. It collapses things, albeit in slow motion. And so collapse is happening all over, and we've been in a depression here for at least a decade. So it's absolutely happening. It's just not happening in the big bang way that we tend to think of it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I think our next question is going to Plain.
Okay.
Catherine, this is Plain. You have referred to a possible economic war against Japan. And as a resident of Japan, I've observed a long series of suspicious occurrences here, from the Toyota shakedown to the earthquakes that took out the largest nuclear complex in the world 4 years ago. Those earthquakes were almost directly under the plant. And so I'm wondering, if you think there is an economic war against Japan, what is the thinking behind it?
Well, you can only guess. I mean, I try and practice pattern recognition, because so many times when you see events like this, they tend to happen as tension is building on a number of economic fronts. So Fukushima happened as General Motors was really struggling. Toyota was just clocking them. And you had a bunch of new investors and the U.S. government in and trying to get out. And I really think if Fukushima hadn't happened, we could see, as of today, General Motors is, reporting improvement in sales. I think we could see General Motors really have hit a wall, or on its way to hitting a wall, if Fukushima hadn't happened. And it was sort of watching the GM story and who's involved that first rang a bell in my head and said, well, this is awfully convenient. But I do think if you look at the U.S. long-term strategic interests in Asia, the greatest threat to the U.S. remaining the hegemon in Asia is not China, but really Japan, and particularly Japan if they ally with China. Now, we've certainly, since World War II, we've sort of organized the finances of Japan. We've harvested tremendous value from Japan, particularly with the yen carry trade and how we've sort of managed the debasement of their currency. So we've certainly soaked Japan for everything they're worth. But if you look at China has a couple of strategic weaknesses. They have an enormous population that they need to keep employed and working, and that makes them surprisingly fragile in terms of their politics vis-a-vis the United States. The second thing is, they don't have strong water resources and other resources. So they're remarkably, they have some real Achilles heels. Japan has enormous technology and intellectual capital. And, if the Japanese and the Chinese ever got together, not to say that there aren't historical tensions there are plenty of them, I think that could cause a real problem for the United States maintaining control of Asia, maintaining control of the sea lanes, really being the Asian hegemon, which is, if the United States is going to continue to maintain its power, it's just got to do. So I think there's reason to want to keep Japan subjugated and away from forming a major alliance with the Chinese to kind of shift power vis-a-vis the United States.
Well, thank you. I observed something that it's now hard to find seismographs here. The one for the Fukushima event looked like it was a nuclear bomb test followed by a regular earthquake. And in the past in Japan, seismographs were in newspapers routinely, so I thought that was kind of interesting.
Right. It's, in all these things, it's impossible to tell. And what I try to do is to just watch the financial patterns, both before, during, and after. And, if you look at the financial patterns and logic in a lot of what look like natural events, more and more to me, all the sort of rumors that these things are engineered by weaponry seem to make more and more sense to me. So I think it's a distinct possibility, but it's, one of the hardest things for all of us is, I think there's nothing more insane than living on a planet where you basically don't understand how the planet's governed, and you don't understand half of the sort of the politics and warfare going on. And it's quite irritating and unnerving to try and manage your life and your assets when everything is a mystery.
Well, I'll second that. Well, thank you for the answer. Catherine, this is a question from forum member Human. Human wants to know why you thought the Asian tsunami off of Aceh might have been an unnatural event. You said on Red Ice Radio, but perhaps it needs repeating, and Human thinks that maybe the Illuminati did the same thing with the Japanese tsunami and says someone was buying up shares of a company that develops houses, and of course the housing market's totally dead here, and then voila, Japan is in desperate need of new housing. And what about Benjamin Fulford, and how will the Japanese respond? And hopefully these people will be nailed and made to answer for their involvement in this atrocity. So Human would like you to comment on that.
What happened on the Indonesian tsunami was I was communicating with somebody who wanted to buy a World Bond Fund, and they bought one about a week before the tsunami, and it had about 2 weeks before, something like that, and it had 15% of its holdings. It was a closed-end fund in Indonesian sovereign debt, and then a week before the tsunami, it dropped overnight by 15% with huge insider trading in a pattern that, to see something like that in a closed-end fund, it was just breathtaking. I'd never seen anything like it. It was kind of, what? Millions of shares transacting, boom, 15% down with no logical reason or explanation. I couldn't make head nor tails of it. I just couldn't fathom what was going on. And it wasn't like there was a big change in the market or interest rates or credit or anything. It was just, and then a week afterwards, the tsunami happened, approximately a week afterwards, which told me they knew. They knew it was coming. And now, I know of one scientist I've talked to who says he can predict an earthquake a week before it comes. So, another possibility is they have the ability to predict, anticipate that something like that is going to come and then just didn't bother to warn anybody. But suffice it to say, I just, on a financial pattern like that, and then if you look at some of the things that happened in Indonesia literally within 24 to 48 hours on different political events, the whole thing looked to me like an economic hit. Same story in Haiti. If you just look at all the economics of it, it just looked like a hit with too much advance notice of something coming down in Haiti. So, now that's not proof or evidence, but what it indicated to me, just if you look at the, that and then what happened immediately after and afterwards, I just think somebody either had foreknowledge or it was an engineered event. And I do believe, just intuitively, if I had to guess, that they have the capability of engineering these things. So, now that doesn't mean it was engineered, but I think with all these things, to the victor go the spoils, and you often, if you watch who benefits, I always say cui bono, who benefits, oftentimes you can see patterns of people either exploiting it or potentially taking advantage of something that was engineered. And those patterns have meaning. Again, they're not evidence, they're not proof. But I think, this goes back to living in a world of tremendous uncertainty. We're watching the integration of warfare into economics in an extraordinary way. And, for example, if you haven't read Jim Norman's Oil Card, I would recommend it to you as one of the best books I know that sort of helps you understand economic warfare today with respect to oil. But we're watching the integration of warfare into literally, day-to-day markets and economics. Part of the problem most of us have is we're trying to use the financial system when the most powerful people in the world are using it as a battlefield. And one of the things that a lot of the BRIC nations are struggling with is they're trying to use the financial system to transact and trade, whereas, all of Wall Street and a lot of financial institutions are using it to engage in, geopolitical warfare. And so the question is it a battleground or is it tools to facilitate real economic activity? So part of that integration is we're watching extraordinary, invasive, invisible technology, whether it's for surveillance and tracking people and aggregating information, whether it's the ability to hack into bank accounts and literally steal money digitally, or whether it's the kinds of technology that, whether warfare or things that look like natural events. I spent a lot of time during the litigation having to investigate and deal with non-lethal weapons, and all sorts of invisible covert operations that are violent in nature. And so, we're struggling with warfare being integrated into everything. And so, there's not enough time in the world to get to the bottom of any of these events. But I think when we look at them, we have to understand that these things are possible and practice pattern recognition just to make sure that we, we have a sense of what may be going on in the world and understand how to protect ourselves and our family in a world where those things are possible.
And then I guess the follow-up to that would be whether you think the Japanese may be able to get revenge or somehow protect themselves from this. What do you think?
I don't. What we've seen globally is you'll see a country cave to or change policies that make no sense. So, for example, right after the first Christchurch earthquake, Hillary Clinton shows up in New Zealand and signs the Wellington Declaration, whereby New Zealand caves on its policy of no nuclear this or that. I believe it included allowing the U.S. nuclear subs to dock in New Zealand. I don't know the details of it, but it's an awfully coincident situation. Or you see when Switzerland for no apparent reason, agreed in the mid-'90s to go off their partial gold standard. Why would the Swiss do that? It doesn't make any sense. Unless you posit that they're literally being threatened with this kinds of weaponry for which, number one, there is no defense, but also weaponry which their populations can't even fathom exists. I think there would be nothing more positive in terms of transparency globally than to have the truth of all this weaponry come out so that the average person could understand it, because I suspect it's the basis of tremendous blackmail. And it's been a controlling force in the political process and sort of the killing of sort of sovereign governments, or the ending of sovereign governments. Now, let's assume for a second that I'm right, that such a weaponry exists. The funny thing is, the only way to protect yourself from this is if millions and millions and millions of people will vote with their prayers, their intentions, their actions and transactions in a way that is completely and utterly out of control. And that is one of the reasons that I so focus, if you come to my website, you'll see a slogan, who's your farmer, who's your banker, where's your money? One of the reasons I'm so focused on the sort of mighty force of the people acting in concert is because, to me, that's the only force that can beat these kinds of weaponry. Particularly in a world where there's transparency about the existence of it. Because the fundamental nature of changing the economic model to something positive is transparency about who's doing this. So one of the reasons that so much of this stuff goes on right now is the people who do it are considered socially acceptable and are honored. So if I engineer, I suspect the Haiti earthquake was engineered. So let's just say, for purposes of the conversation, it was. If I engineer the Haiti earthquake and no one can fathom that it's engineered, they think it's a natural event, and as a result, I arrange for my pals to get extraordinary mineral and oil rights and other assets in the area, and we all get rich. And I come back and I give lots of money to my university and lots of money to charity, and and I'm considered to be quite socially acceptable, and I'm considered to be prominent and prestigious, and I'm wealthy and successful, and so I look like a hero. As long as the people doing this can be considered socially acceptable, there are no solutions. The minute people can see the game and shun them, everything can change. So that's why it's going to have to come down to the kind of actions that I think the WebBot project talks about and encourages. The shift in consciousness and the shift in behavior of millions of people in response to what's going on, and in that is our hope.
Well, I'd like to thank you for being a leader in trying to create these alternatives. And now the next question is from McLaren.
Okay.
Hi, Catherine. In your prior question, you'd said that the markets and money were being used as weapons against the people instead of for growth and development. A number of alternative media financial writers endorse a new theory about money called modern monetary theory, or MMT, and its proposed methodology for guiding the money supply. They range from Edward Harrison of Credit Write-Downs to Billy Mitchell over at Billy Blog, Cullen Roche at PragCap, and also a number of noted academics, Michael Hudson, William K. Black, and the writers over at New Economic Perspectives are doing a sequential series on this. Monetary reformer Bill Still and the aforementioned all favor an approach focusing on the quantity of money and the U.S. government, or an elected and accountable board, acting as the issuing agent rather than having the Fed as the primary determinant of monetary policy. Given its vice-like grip on the current banking system and the financial institutions that they have over the current system, the influence over political dealings that they wield, short of a cratering or some variety of market crash, Is there any way that you see that the money power could be wrestled away from these banksters?
Well, I think the money powers want to have sound currency. You had relatively sound currency. You delinked it, and then you had fiat currency. You used the fiat currency to steal everything. Once you've stolen everything, what do? You want to go back to sound currency so you can keep what you've stolen. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So I think Mr. Global's going to, once he's finished stealing everything, is going to be eager to go back to sound currency. Just like, I think when we kept the price of gold low during the strong dollar policy, he accumulated huge amounts of gold, and now he's perfectly happy to let it rise. So all the people who are screaming about the suppression are now basically, I don't think they realize that they're helping him pump it. So you have to be careful, because the most important questions to answer about a currency are not what questions, they're who questions. Who's in control, who gets the data, who governs, who illuminates, who has access to the illumination. So they're all governance issues, and they all come down to, who is it? And so, and that's why if we just talk about what, or sort of what questions, that's how we constantly get tricked, as Mr. Global kind of flips things back and forth. So I think that's number one. The second thing I would say is, if you come on the ground in a local area, whether in the United States or in Australia or New Zealand or anywhere around the world, the most important issue right now is not currency. The most important issue is food freedom. If we can introduce all the sound currencies we want, and if we don't have food freedom, they will basically be used to engineer fascism on a scale that we can't imagine. Because ultimately, a financial system needs a sound currency. It needs transparency and sort of literacy about how things work. It needs a way of circulating equity, so you have an equity system, not a debt system. And you have to have the ability to create and maintain privacy of individual issues, but sort of transparency of governmental or shared, things like endowments. So, and all of these things are tools within an ecosystem, and you can't fiddle with one without looking at all the others. And so if you take where I live in Tennessee, if you implement a gold and silver currency in here, or a local currency here, but you don't institute food freedom, because right now incomes are plummeting across the United States, and one of the major reasons why they're plummeting is because you have destroyed small farms, not with technology and not with the big guys being more efficient. You've destroyed it by rigging the rules, both with respect to food regulation, food safety, all sorts of food issues, along with the rules about how you can circulate equity capital locally to make it impossible for small farmers who would be highly competitive in a market economy. You've basically thrown so many handicaps on them that they've collapsed. And that, ultimately our GNP, any GNP around the world is a in one sense a multiple of the small farm income and the ability of people to feed themselves without having to go to a corporation and having to produce paper money or any kind of money to get it. So just remember on a currency, the important thing is not just what we do with the currency, but what we do with a whole other host of government rules and regulations, because there's no way to get a sound currency without food freedom. Okay. And right now, if you look at what's happening, if you have never seen it and you can only watch one video that can explain what's going on in the economy today, you can find it on my blog. If you do a search on my blog for Sir James Goldsmith, you will get an interview of Sir James Goldsmith in 94 on Charlie Rose he'd come to the United States to persuade Congress not to adopt the Uruguay Round of GATT and not to institute the World Trade Organization. And he said, if we do this, we will industrialize agriculture globally, and it will be the most disastrous governmental policy ever implemented in Western civilization. And it's quite brilliant, and he's dead on, and it describes exactly what's happening today. And so it's really, really important when you talk about currency that you talk about it in the context of who's in control, how it's governed, and how it dovetails with the most important management and distribution of the most critical assets that we depend on for life itself.
Okay, thank you for your perspective on that. In some of your other interviews, you've intoned that you believe that there will not be a confiscation of gold and silver, as they do not represent a significant portion of the wealth and savings of the average American family, like it was back in the 1930s. When the last underpriced forced sale back to Uncle Sam occurred, things were very different in the financial system and where they are today. Instead, now, today's Mr. Global, evil financial overlord, and minions in government will instead today target retirement savings, 401ks, IRAs, since that's a much larger pool of funds that exist. First, have you seen any legislation that is already enacted that would be or could be contorted to be the Trojan horse enabling this? Or is there pending legislation that would enable it if it were to be enacted?
Okay. Oh, that's a good. Let me take a whack, and if I don't hit everything, just remind me. First of all, most people globally have already experienced tremendous confiscation of their assets, and that's what debasement has been. So between 2003 and 2008. A $10,000 CD earning 5% lost half of its purchasing power in 5 years, whereas gold, even after tax on capital gains, basically held its purchasing power when measured in gallons of gasoline. Now, if you take that one example, and I've done several blog posts on this, and you step back and you look at a community of 100,000 people during that period, what that meant was that by the end of 2008, in the last 5 years, they had lost $3.3 billion of purchasing power as a combination of households, municipality, and community businesses, which is astonishing. I mean, that's a huge confiscation.
Yes.
If somebody had marched, the National Guard into that community and taken $3.3 billion, whether it was 401ks or gold or whatever, there would have been a war. And yet, yet they managed to do it. So make no mistake that confiscation is happening. Now, how is that confiscation happening? My fear is not that they're going to confiscate your gold, and it's not even that they're going to confiscate your 401k. My fear is they're going to confiscate your body and your mind. Because the way I confiscate your money is I fill your mind with entrainment and subliminal programming and all sorts of disinformation, and I fill your body with, a ton of poisons, whether it's fluoride in the water or, GMO food, or it's, whatever they're spraying in chemtrails. And by the time I've hit your body and mind with that cocktail, you can't think clearly. And for example, the debasement, which was extraordinarily profitable for them, the debasement just people have suffered worldwide in the last 10 years. The reason that debasement can happen with very little political pushback, I think, is related, in fact, to the, basically the confiscation of your body and mind. But let's keep going. If you look at my homepage at Solari.com, at the bottom there's a list of some special Solari reports we did, and one of them is proposals for the annuitization of 401ks and IRAs. And it describes the proposals that were being considered last year. There was testimony in the fall regarding this. The reason I'm so concerned about it is exactly what you mentioned, which is as the pressure comes on to finance Social Security, for decades now, the boomers have been cash flow positive. they've been pouring cash into the trust fund, and of course the government's been using to finance a whole variety of things with that money. Now, not only are they, they're continuing to put in cash, but we're anticipating the day when that cash is not available to pay, for general governmental operations. The boomers want that cash back, and so that's a $2 problem because the new dollar isn't available to finance your operations, and now they want $1 back. So now you've got a $2 instead of having a $1, positive cash flow. Now you've got a $2 negative, and so that's why you're seeing this debate about Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. Not because the trust fund isn't, from an accounting standpoint, in reasonably good shape. It's because from a cash flow standpoint, they've emptied it out, and they need to keep emptying it out. And so, the question is, you can't keep using it to finance all sorts of stuff if people want it back. And so if you look at the U.S. debt clock and you say, okay, well, where are they going to get the money to finance it? It's pretty simple. Politically, the logical place to get it is from the people who want their Social Security check and just require their 401ks and IRAs and pension funds finance it. Now, if you look at who, in fact, owns the U.S. government debt, the biggest source of money to the U.S. government debt is not the Chinese and Saudis. As I said last night, it's the U.S. pension funds and retirement savings. So it doesn't, it's the Willie Horton thing. You rob the bank that has money. So I think the 401ks and IRAs are a huge part of wealth, and particularly as to the 401ks are pretty easy to tap into. Getting to the IRAs may be a little more difficult and complicated, but if you just look at the numbers, it's a no-brainer to say it gets there. Now, could they confiscate gold? Yeah, but you get very little money, and you end up picking the most stubborn, irascible, and empowered to fight people who have the wherewithal to fight. So, I just think it's like having a fight with a mule when you're not going to get any filet mignon. Why not just go after, the steer?
Yeah, low-hanging fruit certainly is easier to go after. Okay. The reason I had asked is there have been any number of discussions that have occurred within the forum as to should we be cashing out our 401ks and IRAs, and should there be something from a legal front that looks like it might be confiscatory. People were curious, is this something that I should be doing? Should I cash it out? So with that in mind, what are your views of the best ways for U.S. citizens to protect their wealth? Everyone's situation is different, obviously,
right,
and no solution fits all people's circumstances and needs, but should they cash out their retirement accounts, taking the penalties and tax hits, invest in farmland for self-sufficiency and that food security that you were talking about before? Should they own their own home free and clear, getting out of that debt trap, assuming they intend to stay there, of course, potentially buy an essential services business like a corner gasoline station or some other non-luxury goods and or services merchant where they will be sustainable in their community?
Well, I know this sounds like a cop-out, but I really find everybody is different. So let me just go through the IRA and 401k. Okay. I don't have an IRA, 401k, nor will I ever. It's just not going to happen. Because what I've found over the long sweep of things is whatever benefit you get, and the possible exception is a match on a 401k. So whatever benefit you get, they find a way to siphon away. Now, if you go to my blog and do a search, you'll find a description of why, the specific reasons why I don't have one and never would, because I had a very political situation on a 401k and had to bust it and pay $200, and it was part of a squabble with the federal government. So it's very political, and I just, I said this is a Gestalt thing. I want to control my money, and I'm going to organize my finances so I have control. And I'm not going to get in partnership with somebody whose word is meaningless and who abrogates contracts and uses dirty tricks. So, but my situation is a little bit different. What I try and encourage people to do is to keep an eye on this and to make sure they build assets outside of IRAs and 401ks so that they don't end up completely dependent on the system. So I think it's a matter of balance. And there are lots of different ways you can use an IRA, not a 401k. It depends on the provisions.
The plan.
I mean, there are ways you can do all sorts of things that aren't just same old in the brokerage system. So, and ultimately, though, the decision as to whether you take it out or not, to me, is a political call, and each person has to make it on. It's not a financial call; it's a political guess. But I do say I monitor it very closely because I have clients who are prepared to jump. And so the one thing you do is if you do have IRAs and 401ks, you just want to know what you're going to do if it should look like the capital controls are going to make it a lot less attractive, and you just need to be prepared to jump. If you have a tax situation where it's easy to take some out now without penalty, it's certainly more attractive to do that than if there's a penalty or if it kicks you into a new tax bracket. So it takes a little planning to kind of figure out the most advantageous way to get it out. But whether or not you get it, if you don't get it out, you need to be prepared to jump if that day should come, or to let it get stuck and be an annuity or whatever it is, but then just assume that's your long-term dollar exposure as part of your portfolio. Now, in terms of what else you do, I think, that's a complex question, but number one is our balance sheets have been intermediated. That's number one, which means, once upon a time we grew our own food and we did things for ourselves, and we didn't need money because we were doing more stuff for ourselves. Now what we're doing is we're putting our money into the company stock, and then we're buying our food at the company store, and we've basically been disintermediated. I tell the story of 3 women in Tennessee who, one was owning Citicorp stock at about, I think at the time she was estimating she was getting 4 or 5% on the stock, and another woman who had CDs at the local bank, and I think Citibank was their correspondent, so we figured Citibank was getting their money at about 3 or 4%, and then one of their close friends was borrowing money on her Citibank credit card for 24%. So here you have 3 women in Tennessee who are being arbitraged as what we used to call on Wall Street a 2,000 basis point spread. Because Citibank's getting the money at 4% and lending it out to their best friend at 24%. Well, it doesn't, if they just talk to each other and re-engineer it among themselves or with the help of a local bank, they could make a fortune by cutting Citibank out. And that's disintermediation. And so it's whether it's doing more for yourself or finding those opportunities to cut out the big guys. The economics are changing. I always tell the story of a client who was complaining that her water bill was going up and the yields on her portfolio were going down. And I said, it's very simple. Sell your stock and build a well. That's an example of disintermediation. And more of those opportunities are going to pop up in our balance sheets and income statements. We just have to be sensitive to it. So clearly that's one. And part of it is using your money to get bad guys out of your life. Because debasement is not just about the reduction of your savings or the value of your dollars. Debasement is something that's happening across your income statement and your balance sheet. So, for example, if you look at your utility bill, well, let's say your utility bill has been going up 10% a year. What you don't understand is the quality of the product has been going down. If you have a dirty electricity problem, if they're putting on a smart meter, you may be paying for your utility bill with your life. So the debasement is not just in the money, it's in the quality of the products and services, and there's this invisible debasement that sometimes we don't see. Okay, so one is disintermediate, do more for ourselves, invest money in building up our own infrastructure. 2 is obviously, I'm a great believer in precious metals. For this period of time, we're going through a fundamental shift between paper assets and real things, and for most people, precious metals is relatively simple, relatively liquid, and it's absolutely something we can all do. A third thing is if you want to be an entrepreneur, if you are an entrepreneur, building up a source of skills and enterprise that can help you generate an income in this environment is absolutely invaluable. So everybody needs income. Everybody needs the ability to be useful, and building those skills and creating enterprises that can generate income is very, very important. I sort of call that U Inc. And that includes doing whatever you have to do to make sure you're healthy. One of the things I find with many of my clients is they underspend on the quality of food and health, not realizing, I said before, I'm worried that they can confiscate your body, but if you're very clever about maintaining your health and high-quality food and spending whatever money you have, you then have a clear mind and a healthy body, which can generate income and generate barter under the worst circumstances, whereas if you don't have that, it's much harder for them to confiscate your mind and your body than it is your 401k. So just remember to invest in U Inc. And then finally, I do continue to be help people invest in securities, because I think if we put all of our money in gold and silver and put it in a vault and look at it, the world really will collapse, because the thing that keeps the world operating is enterprises that do useful things. So I think there's an explosion of healthy development around the globe. We are rebalancing the global economy. There are many aspects of that can be positive. And so I think there's an awful lot of opportunity to invest in enterprises in the growing markets, particularly where the culture is healthy, or particularly where you have a younger population. So there's a lot of equity opportunity as well. So, I don't think it's a simple thing. It's a very different paradigm that most people, certainly in the United States, have followed. But, the shift to global is upon us, and it's not just happening because Mr. Global wants it. It's because people want it too.
Okay. Wow. Thank you very much for that answer, Catherine. Really do appreciate it. Some of the folks here would like to take a break, if that's okay with you.
Uh-huh.
Hi, this is McLaren. We're back, and we've been speaking with Catherine Austin Fitts. Please visit her website on the internet at www.solari.com. That's SOLARI.com. It's all about building personal and family wealth in changing times. At this point, we want to talk to Catherine about precious metals, and for that next question, we'll ask Groundrod to lead it off.
Yeah, Catherine, thanks for all those great answers. I think there's a lot of us around the world that want to stand hand in hand with Miss Local, and we've all had enough of Mr. Global. My first question is, are you aware of how much movement of gold is coming into the market out of Iran?
It wouldn't surprise me. That wouldn't surprise me at all. But I don't know. And it's like many other things where getting information that you trust is near impossible.
Right. I just wanted to know if there was anything on that and how it would affect the PM market. Moving on, let's see, I had an inspiration one day and shared an article on the front page of our forum which speculates on how silver could become more valuable than gold. Do you think that silver could become more valuable than gold, or?
Well, I think if you look historically, if you look at the long sweep of history, what we see cycles back and forth between periods when paper assets are dominant, and then period when tangibles are dominant, and then paper, and then tangibles. And if you look back, and I'm now referring to James Turk of Gold Money's analysis, what he shows is that and at the end of the long-term bull market in tangibles, the gold-silver ratio is 15-1. Now, if that's the case, the gold-silver ratio today is a little bit over 40. If the gold-silver ratio were to fall to 15-1 at the end of this shift, as assuming that history happens again, which it doesn't always, but if we just see the historical pattern, then we would expect silver to outperform gold over this time period. And so I'm expecting from today to the end of the shift that silver will probably outperform gold, because you'll probably see the gold-silver ratio fall from 43, I think it is right now, down to about 15. Now, if and when that happens, 1 ounce of gold will still buy 15 ounces of silver. So could I see a world where 1 ounce of silver could buy 15 ounces of gold? Unlikely, unless, the technology that we sometimes hear whispered by, people who've had a little too much to drink is, they can create gold out of lead or something. The technology exists. So, without that kind of technology, I just don't see an ounce of silver being worth more than an ounce of gold.
Well, my article goes to the idea of the basically people have had it with the banksters and central control folks that have tied up all the gold in very few places, or maybe that's not true, but I just don't know if you wanted to trade me for the deer, whether I'd care if it was a piece of gold or a piece of silver, and can easily see 1-to-1. With industrial demands continuing, I just see silver could potentially do better than gold, but that's just me.
Well, I do think if we get to the point where gold and silver are being used as currency, that the divisibility of silver is going to make it it's going to create demand for silver much more than gold in some ways. So I do think that silver's divisibility could add tremendously to its value in some scenarios. And I would point out, if you haven't yet, we have something called the gold-silver payment calculator. If you come to my website and you link to it, it will convert back and forth between gold and silver and currency, fiat currency, about 20 different currencies. So you can convert back and forth between the Kiwi dollar, the U.S. dollar, the Australian dollar, back and forth into gold and silver.
Yeah, nice job on that, by the way.
If you go, there's an equivalent page, and it lists all the sort of common bullion coins and prices them at melt value. We get a feed from Gold Money. And I was just meeting with Franklin Sandersby. We just approved the iPhone app, which should be rolling out. I believe we're going to start marketing this week, but you should be able to download it. And basically, one of the reasons we want that is we want merchants and people to have on their handheld devices a way to toggle back and forth. It'll be free. So and we think that's one of the critical little tools that needs to be floating around if we're going to start transacting. Of course, here in the States, one of the other issues is getting the state treasurers and legislatures to agree not to try and charge sales tax when we use it as a currency. So those are some of the steps. But I agree the divisibility of silver in certain scenarios could give rise to the gold-silver ratio falling.
Yeah, and love your interviews with Franklin. Thanks for those. I guess our next question's from Vito.
Hi, Catherine. This is Vito.
Hi.
Hi. I realize we've already endured a 90% debasement in the U.S. dollar or Federal Reserve note, and I realize your perspective on the confiscation of our minds and our bodies, and that why try to get filet mignon out of a mule. But assuming that things aren't that bad off, and at cost of being repetitive, why don't you think there will be eventual gold confiscation? Even after hyperinflation debasement, won't Mr. Global need gold for a new currency as opposed to the digital currency that you spoke of earlier? Do you really think that people will swallow the digital currency scheme?
Oh, I think he'll want gold. And now that, gold can be digital too. You can have fiat gold. But I think he'll want gold, and one of the arguments for not confiscating is he's going to want some popular support to push for the gold. So right now there's a groundswell of people pushing for gold on the theory that it's what's good for the grassroots, but what they're pushing is what's good for Mr. Global. So why confiscate? The amounts they have in the scheme of things are tiny. Not to say that it wouldn't be useful to have them, but if he wants, on the theory that he's used fiat currency to steal everything, if he wants to shift back to sound currency with gold at the center of it, which is exactly where I think he wants to go, then why confiscate? Why not just have those people pushing to help get where he wants to go? If you come to my blog tonight at Solari.com/blog, what you'll see is we made a new cartoon of Mr. Global. And at the top of the blog, what it says is Mr. Global Squeeze Play, because it's quite nifty what he just did. He had Congress insist on no taxes on corporations and no taxes on the wealthy, so he got a get-out-of-jail-free card on taxes, and then had S&P basically hand down a dictum that says he has more power to dictate terms and conditions and can charge a higher profit on lending money to the United States government, municipalities, and consumers. So, he doesn't have to pay any more taxes, but he gets to charge more money in the process of lending back to us the money he got gifted to him on the bailouts. It's quite neat. So I don't. Why should Mr. Global confiscate a little bit of gold? When the people. Anyway, so my example here is, if you talk to, I was just out in San Francisco for a couple months, and if you talk to people out there, they're furious because they think that truly this came from the right wing and all these grassroots and nuts in the South. They don't sort of understand it didn't come from there. It came from Mr. Global. So he's done a very good job of getting people to believe that the grassroots is insisting on those stuff, when in fact it's much more engineered for his benefit and by him. It's going to be the same with the gold. I mean, I think you're seeing a lot of people push for gold currencies and sound currency and gold this and that. And in fact, it's going to work exactly to his advantages and to where he wants to go. So I think it's part of where this thing is now. Here's the problem. The problem we're watching a centralization of the economy that's fundamentally lawless and does not respect the rights, including the property rights of the average person. And in that scenario, anything can and will be confiscated, and economic values are harmed because the leverage in a financial system, the multiple of a stock depends on a belief in the rule of law. As soon as the rule of law goes away, Whole Foods doesn't trade at 34 to 1 or a multiple of 34. They trade at a multiple of 1. So when things are lawless, anything can be confiscated, and the danger is, that he does not want you and me to have property rights, at which point, everything gets confiscated. At one point, Chris Pallet-Gatta wrote, the Gold Antitrust Action Committee wrote a letter to Treasury and said, do you preserve the right and power to confiscate gold? And they wrote back a letter. It's up on the Gatta website, and they said, we reserve the right to confiscate everything.
Jeez. Oh.
Right. So all I'm saying is, we're sitting in a world where they're in the process of confiscating your mind, your body, your health. They're debasing your currency. They're debasing the quality of all sorts of products and services. They're debasing your time. Could confiscation of precious metals happen? Yes, but if you look at the whole panoply of what's being confiscated, you need to see it in context of that. And what's important is to protect yourself against all of those confiscations, not just gold and silver.
Very good. Okay. Well, now my other question was regarding silver and the 15-to-1 ratio, but you pretty much answered that. But if you had to be pinned down to making a prognostication, do you think that'll happen this year, next year, or the year after, given that Mr. Global can do it any time that he wants? If you had to make a guess, what would it be?
I really don't know, because I think part of it is I think that Mr. Global knows where he wants to go, but it's emergent how it's going there. There are two possibilities. You know, Tina Turner said we can do this nice or rough, and one way to do it is to keep sort of doing the slow burn for a couple more years, say between now and 2015, 2020. The other is to do what's called a radical debasement, which is the way you deal with the global debt problem is you go to bed, you know, tonight and gold's at 1680, and you wake up tomorrow morning and gold's at 5,000, and you've just dealt with the debt problem. So you can do it fast or slow. If you do the slow burn, the value of gold depends on how much money you print. So it really has more to do with the printing press of the fiat currencies than it does to gold, because we're quoting prices not in gallons of gasoline, but in dollars of something that's being, you know, that's in a state of QE perpetual. So there's really no way to know which one it's going to be. And I think, you know, I tend to think it's going to be slow burn, because what they're looking to do is rebalance the global economy and bring up the emerging markets in a way that offset the aging populations in Europe and the United States. And so, you know, to me, it's more logical that they'll continue to slow burn the thing. But, and that sort of fits in with the global population who gets up every day and makes their money and livelihood by keeping things working. So there's enormous alignment that way. So I think the slow burn is more likely, and so that means the ratio, you know, it could take many years.
Okay. Well, great. I appreciate the answer. We're now going to move on to the next subject, which is the powers that be, and Green Meadow is going to fire a question at you.
Okay.
Hi, Catherine. I keep feeling like the powers that be, or Mr. Global, is his own worst enemy. Like once the banks started having problems when they stopped trusting each other. Can the powers that be survive if they stop trusting each other? How do you think they are their own worst enemy?
Well, here's the $64,000 question, and that is, who's really in control? Mm-hmm. And this comes down, we know there's very advanced technology flying spaceships around the planet. And the question is, are those people from Earth or are those people from someplace else? And, you know, and I don't begin to know the answer to that question, but I think that's the most important question that we don't know the answer to. And depending on, you know, how you answer that, then very different things fall out. Because if we're talking about, you know, if we're talking about somebody who has, you know, the ability to force, who has superior military technology, who literally thinks of themselves as a different species and who is looking to extract subsidy from an entire planet, it's a very different situation than if we just have a group of humans who's kind of gone off and come up with a psychotic plan to rule the world. And, you know, and so the question is, which is it? And you get very, very different scenarios depending on your assumptions to that answer. Now, let's just assume it's a group of humans who've gone off and come up with a plan to centralize. there's a lot that can happen as the system centralizes to force them to, start to compete. And I think if you look at what it takes, whether you're running an enterprise, whether you're running a government, whether you're running a family, any organization or group, generally to get things done over a long period of time and to run things productively, people have to share goals and they have to share principles, and those principles have to have a higher purpose than just what's in it for me. And when you don't have those higher goals and those higher principles, you tend to fall into lawlessness, and that's when things like what I call the Midianite thing happen. And I think as I watch what's happening, if this is a group of humans, I don't think the New World Order can hold it together with the kind of goals and values and principles that they currently share. I think as long as you're engineering things covertly, it can work. When you have to come out of the closet, I think it falls apart, particularly when things are this centralized. Now, I say that if, in fact, the people in control are off-planet, that's a whole different kettle of fish. And, and I hate to say this, just, there are too many uncertainties in that scenario. So, I would throw it out to you guys. Which one is it?
That's a great question. Yeah, I guess it's just I keep feeling like the powers that be are going to in some way take themselves down.
Here's the thing to remember. Let me speak on behalf of Mr. Global. One of the, we all tend to think that the corruption is at the top. And I have to tell you, I've spent time in my life at the top, at the bottom, in the middle. I've had a very interesting series of experiences that had me sort of, at every level in many different parts of the world and many different constituencies. And what I have to tell you is everybody's a prisoner of the system, and oftentimes Mr. Global is, because the problem is if you have a population in which people are easily tricked and will sell each other out for pennies, the problem is if you run things ethically, then the guy who doesn't will win and use his money and success, including his support of the crowd, to kill you. And so Mr. Global is also a prisoner of the greed and sort of corruption at the bottom too. So it's a chicken and egg dilemma, and part of the challenge for Mr. Global is how do I get out of the trap? I mean, my personal experience has been that the crowd supports the guy who wins. So I'll give you an example. I'm Christian, and I was at a revival for Christian women that T.D. Jakes does called Women Thou Art Loosed in the summer of 2000, and I was standing with my minister. The minister was teaching me in my church's Bible class, and she used to work at the DEA, and there's nothing about government drug trafficking and, sort of drug trafficking by prominent Americans that she doesn't know. And George W. Bush came in on monitor, and the whole crowd, 100,000 African-American women, jumped up cheering for him. So afterwards I said to her, Patricia, I just lost, millions of dollars in cash and probably a couple $100 million in equity and many years of my life and risked my life to try and stop narcotics trafficking and related financial fraud by the Bushes and the Clintons. And you jumped up cheering for Bush. And she said, well, he's going to be the winner. And I said, so he's the winner and I'm a loser. And she said, yeah, that's right.
Wow.
Now, well, but I could tell you hundreds of stories like that. And if you go back and you look at the story of crucifixion, which is a very, whether you think it's true or not, it's a very important part of our mythology, which is, the Pontius, the Jews, the priests wanted wanted Jesus crucified. But Pontius Pilate and the Romans knew that was very bad politics. So they offered the crowd a criminal or Jesus and said to the crowd, which do you want killed? And the crowd chose the criminal to be freed. Now, that's traditionally what Mr. Global has been taught his whole life, is the crowd will support the criminal. The crowd will never support the guy who's financially responsible. And I have to tell you, I've been a government official and then a government contractor who tried to create a constituency for financial responsibility. I have yet to see one, indication that it exists. Now, I continue to promote it because I don't want to be a part of genocide. So I'd rather sit in the wilderness and promote financial responsibility than, make money on genocide. But what I will tell you is I have yet to see very, much indication. I mean, make no mistake about it, the housing bubble in America was not engineered by Mr. Global. The housing bubble was engineered by thousands and thousands of mortgage brokers, home builders, and appraisers in county after county and community after community who knew perfectly well this was destroying their county.
So as much as we're dealing with them, they're dealing with us.
Yes. Right. Everybody's a prisoner of the model. And you can go very, very high in the hierarchy, and what you will find is you'll find many different kinds of things, but you will find a lot of wonderful people who are prisoner of the system.
Wow.
So there's a more complicated story, and I'll just tell you the other one, because if I really try and get people to get this story into their spirit because it's so important. In the summer of 2000, who here has heard me tell the red button story? Anybody heard me tell it?
We know the red button story.
Okay, so the red button story is an example of the fact that I've asked the red button question in just audience after audience. I was up in Pioneers in Alaska. Only 50% of the audience would push the button at Pioneers. Okay, now, how do you push the button globally? In America, you're not going to get a dramatic change without 80% of the people saying they push the button. Well, if 50% of Pioneers would push the button, how do you expect 80% of the American people to push the button?
Unless they were forced to push the button?
Well, you need a huge consensus of people who are willing to push the button to get real political change. And to date, what most people are saying is, I will not endure any inconvenience, and I'm not going to change. I would rather just let somebody market narcotics to the children next door than deal with any economic inconvenience. Now, what I have to tell you from a spiritual standpoint, because I think the fundamental basis of all reality is spiritual, if billions of people are walking around saying it's okay to kill the kids next door so that my mutual funds go up in value, then what I have to tell you is spiritually we're offside and nothing good can come of it. And that change has to be everyone, because we have to say, okay, I'm not separate, and what happens to you happens to me. And so the basis of law is I'm going to protect you, because by protecting you, I protect myself. But right now, the culture, particularly in the United States, is one that is absolutely committed to lawlessness on the theory that it's in my self-interest to have the absence of law.
Okay. Well, my next question was about the differences between the elites and the average person, because I feel like there's some almost cultural misunderstanding. Like I don't understand their side and they don't understand my side in some ways. And that may not even be true, but what differences do you see between perspectives and ideologies and fears? I mean, how can we understand each other better?
Oh, well, that's an excellent question, and it's part of the challenge is you literally have a situation where, people can't fathom life outside of their own individual stream, whatever that stream is. They're kind of they're in their own little bell jar, and the behavior within their bell jar is encouraged. Is really psychotic. One of my favorite books for understanding the current environment is Political Ponerology, which talks about the ability of some people who are literally, it basically posits that about 5% of the people born have an attitude and approach towards life which is essentially psychotic and lacks empathy for other people. And, these people have an ability to find each other and act in their self-interest. Part of the challenge is that most people can't fathom, the non-psychotic people can't fathom that the psychotic people are really psychotic and they're really doing what they're doing. And so part of what has to happen is they have to be able to fathom it. And so part of what you see going in society is a general inability, both at the top and the bottom, to figure out who's behaving in psychotic ways and why and how to deal with it. And so, because you have these groups that are unbelievably predatory in practice and think it's just hunky-dory to be that way. And so one of the things that is tremendously needed is an ability and willingness of lots of people to identify that and to shun it, to treat it as though it was socially unacceptable. If tomorrow we woke up and whether it was at the top or the bottom, non-human kind of behavior was identified and shunned, it would have a tremendous impact on what's going on. So part of it is that. I think in the short run, we're in a situation in many countries where so much money has been stolen, and now the way to continue the financings is simply to pull the rug out from under the middle class. That it's very, very hard to have a dialogue between the two groups unless there's a positive vision of how you can get from here to there. And so long as somebody has a plan to implement technology that is truly invasive and fascistic, I don't see how you can have a positive conversation other than to bring transparency. So step number one is to completely roll over the notion of attacking somebody for saying something outside the official reality. So let me give you an example. On the Solari report, we did 3 very in-depth looks at chemtrails. What is chemtrail? Why is it happening? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And before I did those, I got lots of pushback from subscribers saying, if you do this, you'll never be socially acceptable again, and this will just brand you as a nut, and blah, blah, blah. Well, that's not what turned out at all. It turned out to be a phenomenally successful series, very, very useful to the subscribers in very practical ways, from, how they approach preventative health to where they live, blah, 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 blah. So, in terms of my work as an investment advisor, incredibly pertinent to their lives and what I do and how I try and add value. So to me, the first step is we've got to strip away the veils and we've got to have a real conversation, because I can't hold you accountable whether you're at the top or the bottom unless, I can open up the map and we can talk about what in the world is really going on. And the reality is, if we have that conversation, then we have to come back to how, if you're Mr. Global, your hands are tied, which gets back to the question of, okay, well, who's really running around in those spaceships? Because that guy has technology that's so much more advanced than everybody else that he's being able to dictate what's going on. So to me, that's step one. And I would just mention, I'm kind of going on, so I apologize for that, but there's a documentary coming out on November 11th called Thrive, which I and many other people have been a part of, and it's a real effort to start a global conversation about what's really going on, and it's the first really high-quality production I've ever seen that will do that and do it in many different languages globally, streaming through the Internet. So I would, if you go to my blog and do a search for Thrive, you'll pick up a link to their website. So I encourage you to take a look at it. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that was a wonderful answer. I thank you for all the transparency you've been providing, and really that's what we're trying to do with these interviews. So this is perfect. And I'll turn the next question over to Plain.
Catherine, you've referred to GMO food and control of water as being possible methods for the powers that be to continue their control grid after the loss of petroleum as a control mechanism. And so how do you see the current state of GMOs and water resource concentration? And is it possible that a lot of petroleum is nearing the state where the powers that be can't prevent it from reaching the market, and thus they want to blow up the Middle East?
I don't think they need to blow up the Middle East to control it. I think I don't. If I had to guess, I would think. I think the peak oil theory is a bunch of bunk. My guess is we have a lot more oil reserves than anybody knows about, particularly in this country. There's been a real effort to first exploit the oil reserves outside this country. But I think as I look around, and I would refer again to Jim Norman's wonderful book, The Oil Card, I think you see a lot of covert operations and sabotage of a plentiful oil supply to try and keep the oil price high. And I think one of the reasons the oil price is kept high is to try and checkmate China. So if you look at sort of the geopolitics between the United States, Russia, and China, we wanted we wanted the price low to bust the Russians in the 90s, but now we want the price high so that we can kind of checkmate the Chinese. And I think that Jim's hypothesis, which is what I just described, is pretty much dead on. I do think, for a variety of reasons, that oil will not suffice as the global currency or the asset backing a global currency, and that's why I think they're going to food. And to me, the most dangerous thing in the world is the patenting of life. And so genetically modified food is, to me, chilling, and the industrialization and control of agriculture is terrifying. And, literally, as of 10 years ago, you had about 2 to 3 billion small farmers on the planet. You wipe them out, and you're talking about genocide and social engineering on an unfathomable scale. So, but I think there's a real effort to get GMO food and the patenting of life adopted globally, and it really is the death of birth.
Well, that's pretty frightening to contemplate. Another question I have is the attempt at a color revolution or civil war in Libya seems to have largely come to a dead end, and it's likely to require significant effort just to keep parts of eastern Libya under NATO control. And even then, they would lose an election if they were to hold one. So what do you expect the NATO powers to do now? And do you think that this may signify something bigger regarding the strategy of balkanizing or overthrowing Arab states? And do you think that a key part of this is trying to control Africa? Do you see this as being a move to fend off the challenge from China and the Africans themselves to change the way they do things?
Well, pretty much yes to a lot of the things they've said. I think you need everybody on the grid. So you have a couple of countries that don't have central banks, aren't using J.P. Morgan Chase as their depository. There's just a great article it'll be up on the blog on Monday about how Kentucky is now, all of their accounts are run by J.P. Morgan Chase. So you have a couple of countries that are sort of outside the banking system, or the infrastructure that you need to do a global currency, and you can't afford for those guys to be outside. So Libya's got to come in, Iraq's got to come in, et cetera. And so North Korea's got to come in. You're sort of seeing those guys targeted and being worn down in a variety of ways. So I think that's happening, number one. Number two, there's no doubt about it that the control of Africa, there's a real gold rush on to own and control Africa and to depopulate Africa in the process of owning and controlling it. So, and that's very, very important, particularly for the farmland and the natural resources. So, but I think any country that's outside of the central banking, J.P. Morgan Chase's their depository system, is in for a real war until the bankers get them on their grid.
Well, what about the situation in Libya, though? I mean, I would say that if you look at real news, 90% of the people there now support the government, and, I mean, all you're left with is mercenaries and special forces.
Yeah. And so the question is,
where does that lead, I guess?
Well, it depends. I don't know enough about, there's the control you're trying to affect, and there's the spin you're trying to use to cover. So if you can go in and get control of a place and provide air cover in the form of the people who really want us there, and we're bringing equality of women, and we're doing all these good works, that's sort of the spin that justifies you going in and getting done whatever you want. I think the question is, if they can't get the spin, will they still go ahead and just do whatever they want? And if they want it, yeah, they will, because they can. Well,
I guess part of the question is, again, what price they're willing to pay. One of the big hawks behind this, Anne-Marie Slaughter, the key, security advisor type, who wrote the book, The New World Order, she was a big hawk at the beginning, and now she's saying, no, this is, the human rights, we're making it worse, so now we need a negotiated settlement. So she's kind of changed her tune dramatically, and I would think she's a key player in the whole thing. So it would be interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I'm not close enough to it. What I will say is and this is the danger in a centralized system, you'll see a neighborhood in the United States that will figure out a way to back drug dealing out of that neighborhood, and the next thing you know, and let's say it's engineered by 20 soccer moms, the next thing you know, you literally have black helicopters coming down on the soccer moms. And they can't fathom that it's happening because they can't imagine why anybody would care about their tiny little neighborhood and these tiny little profits. The problem is, though, the system is very centralized, so you can't afford to have an exception. Now, you also can't afford for too many people to get their back up in a way that sets off a global storm of people saying, look, these guys are going to kill us all, so let's fight them now. So you have to be careful, and you have to care about what your spin is. But the reality is, if there are 5 countries outside the grid, and you've got to get them in the grid to do, you've got to get them in the grid, and you've got to get all their people texting and on cell phones to do a digital global currency, then I assure you, whatever you have to do, you're going to do, whether it's biowarfare or killing everybody or imploding the place or starving everyone. You'll do whatever you have to do because you can't afford to have one holdout in a centralized system.
Well, certainly they're doing a lot of that. They're, targeting their food and so on. But on the other hand, I think, particularly in Europe, the political price has become very high as now so many people are aware of it. And so the whole humanitarian right to intervene, shall we say, or responsibility to intervene is what they've been promoting for the last few years, is fraying at the edges dramatically, especially in Europe and other places like Brazil or what have you. So I think they might want to back off.
The spin has worn thin. The spin is, and I'll tell you, I don't know if have you ever seen Charlie Ferguson's documentary No End in Sight?
No, I haven't. What's it about?
He's Ferguson's the guy who made Inside Job. Before he made Inside Job, he did a remarkable documentary on the occupation of Iraq, and it shows the very systematic and organized, some people would even say demonic intentional destruction of all culture and infrastructure. You're basically systematically destroying civilization. And as a matter of intentional government policy. And he does a very good job of documenting what we've done in Iraq. And I think it's examples like that, or, Kosovo is another example, but examples where it's been clearly demonstrated that what we're doing is we are systematically destroying civilization. There's a great book on sort of the implosion of Russia in the 90s. Very much, sort of the U.S. government teamed up with the Russian mafia. And there's literally in 10 years, you went from having, I think, 14 million people living in poverty to 100 million people living in poverty. The population went down, I think, by about 25 million. So dramatic death. And there's a story at the end of the book of a lawyer who's living without electricity, growing her own food just to survive. And she says, we are being demodernized. And I think that's happening.
It's probably the agenda for Africa.
Well, the agenda for Africa is depopulation. I mean, there's and wouldn't surprise me if one of the reasons they wanted Obama as the president or they wanted Condoleezza Rice as the Secretary of State, when you have an agenda that is that aggressively depopulation, you want to put a black face on it because it's that bad.
Well, for sure. On a related topic, going into the topics of war, I guess one of the questions is how the American military is likely to respond. I mean, do you think there will be an IMF shock at some point for Western countries, and particularly the U.S.? And then is there a risk that the powers that be could lose control of the military or elements of the military? Don't know if that would lead to a military takeover, but at least, what shall we say, resistance within the military to the whole agenda.
It's a good question, and I'm not close enough to the military now to know. I think if I were the U.S. military, I would be unbelievably frustrated because part of the challenge of governing the United States and governing the United States military is for many, many years you've had a federal credit mechanism which basically could borrow whatever it wanted without any accountability or responsibility. So if you're a government official, trying to manage that responsibly is difficult because there's no framework to optimize around. It's kind of, you can't say no because you can always get more money, and that's part of what's driven things as far out of control as they have. And so there's a tendency to create messes and leave the military holding the bag. And there's been tremendous pressure to use the military budget basically to pump up corporate profits in a way that, creates a lot of activity for corporations, a lot of profit, but leaves the military sort of strangled in what it can and cannot buy. In other words, its budget is not created by government smart military policy where they need to go and what they need to be. It's sort of what makes money for Lockheed Martin, et cetera. And you're in a situation where, and it's very frustrating, your biggest defense contractor and arms provider is also your biggest provider of accounting and information services. So you're kind of hamstrung. And so what I've watched over my lifetime is the powers that be constantly funding an endowment so that they can have a private military and building private military capacity within the corporations and defense contractors that literally strips the governmental military of its real powers. So where that leaves them, the military's certainly been left holding the bag in the Middle East. They're certainly being left holding the bag on the budget in ways that are very frustrating. What they have the power to do and not do with their forces spread all over the world in ways that are pretty thin at times, I don't know. But I think, this is a little bit like the age-old squabble between the lawyers and the engineers. The lawyers and Wall Street have once again left the military kind of high and dry, and it's going to be interesting to see what they do about it.
Well, as a thought experiment, it would be most interesting to find out what would happen if 10% of the U.S. officer corps started reading Solari.com.
Oh, well, I'd be delighted to have them. It's funny because if you look at people, if you say where in the, and it's not really the proper term to use civil service, but where in the sort of Mandarin bureaucracy is the most talent of people who are mission-driven and have extraordinary ability and talent and have some other intelligent perspective on life. They're adults. They don't just wander around behaving like the guys at Goldman Sachs or, walk around saying, what about me? What about me? I mean, they're adults and they think outside of just what about themselves. The greatest amount of those people are still in the military. And so within the United States military, there's a lot of healthy adults running around, and this is an environment where every healthy adult is exceptionally valuable and is a source of great hope. So I have no idea, but I'm always hopeful.
Okay, thanks. Now I'm turning it over to Jules.
Hello, Catherine.
Hi.
Catherine, hi. Robert Baer, former CIA section chief, which the movie Syriana and its lead character George Clooney was based on, recently said that he firmly believes, from his opinion and inside sources, that Israel would attack Iran in September or October, with the possibility of the US being dragged into the war. This seems to be playbook straight out of banking and warfare model. Cliff has had a long-term data called the Israeli mistake for almost a decade. In your opinion, what's the likelihood of an Israeli-Iran war, and how concerned are you that it could lead to another world war, given the fact that how the economy is traveling at the moment?
It's an excellent question, and I don't know. I do believe if the Israelis could engineer it, that they would. And the question is, can they be stopped? And I don't know the answer. But to me, it's always a possibility. But I just don't know how to handicap the probabilities. And it could happen. It could happen. And I think, that's the danger as you look across what's happening globally. We have a situation where what has been rising to the top in lots of different industries and lots of different governments are the people who are good at crime, the people who are good at force, because that's what's been working. And so you end up with lots and lots of very aggressive people who are good at predatory behavior, and there's no way for them to resolve their differences. To a certain extent, they've been resolving their differences by getting together and agree to steal from everybody else. So the insiders just keep harvesting the outsiders, but when as the parasite destroys the host, at some point the different parts of the parasite start attacking each other because there's nothing left to steal from the host, and now they've got to steal from each other. So, and that's war. So could it come? Yes, it could come. It could come because these guys, how can I describe it? It's very hard unless you've been in government. You have. I'll never forget sitting with a congressman in it's probably 1990. 97, 98, we're having dinner in the congressional dining room, and he was waiting. He's on the Appropriation Committee, and he was waiting to be called for the vote. You know, the bell went off, and so right in the middle of dinner, he said, he jumped up and he looked at me and he said, "Let's face it, honey, I'm only here to protect my shit." And so you've had a process where no one cares about the whole, and nobody's responsible for the whole. Everybody just cares about their shit. And so you get this situation where you get a spiral down in the whole because everybody's so busy taking their shit, you know, they destroy the whole. And that's how you end up in war. And given this ethic of everybody only caring about their shit, you know, I think you know, the danger is we run into more war than the planet can handle. But, you know, war's been going on. The thing is, if anything has saved us, it's the fact that we found ways of engaging in invisible war and covert war, and we've integrated war into the economic system. And as Orwellian and bizarre as it is, it's probably better than nuclear war.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. We're going to take a real quick break here. You're listening to TMRN, Time Monk Radio Network. We're speaking with Catherine Austin Fitz of the Solari Report, which goes behind the headlines to reveal what's really happening in the global financial system. Please visit her website at www.solari.com. Now we're going to throw over to Green Meadow for the next question. Green Meadow?
Hi there. I work with home health in the over 65 population, and they have had great faith in their country in the past, but they're starting to feel like they have been betrayed. And they're not sure how they've been betrayed, but they're starting to get angry. They're also very scared and dependent of their government. There seem to be active efforts on the parts of the powers that be to reduce their life expectancy. How do you see this group being a player in the coming times as they wake up?
Now, is the group you're talking about physically active, or are they?
Since I'm working in home health, most of them are not, but I do also know active over 65s.
Okay. I used to have a pastor who used to say, if we can face it, God can fix it. And I think there's a lot that the over 65 can do, because what's interesting is the over 65 remember when the world was a relatively safe place for them within a community or a neighborhood. I mean, they can remember a much more civilized way to do things. They're often very experienced and knowledgeable. They have a lot of practical wisdom, and they also, some of them have some savings and assets. And if you look at things on a community by community basis, where you have the over 65s kind of team up with the middle generation and the younger generation, and it often happens through families. So you'll see the 65 plus and the middle generation get together and help the youngsters start businesses or come into businesses, where you get this sort of aligning between the generations, and them use their assets and their knowledge to help each other succeed. Something very, very positive can happen. And the other thing is, I'm a great believer on the power of meditation and prayer. And if you look at people who are over 65 and literally cannot be very active or get out of, they're dealing in home care situations, what's interesting is they can always pray. They can always meditate. They can always do something that will have a dramatic impact in helping to kind of cleanse and shift the field in the psychic storm. So I think there's a tremendous amount they can do. And one of the things we have to do is make sure that the generations don't get alienated from each other, because when that happens, you really give Mr. Global a chance to control. So the other thing I found with people in a home care situation is you want them to be able to feel good about doing what they can do. And that's why I keep coming back to prayer and meditation or things that they can do just in their building or in their home. And you want them to feel good about what they can do because, in fact, if you look at the real solutions, if everybody's just doing what they can do in their piece, it's quite remarkable what can happen. The other thing is anything they can do to protect themselves financially is important. And, and step one, I hate to say it, and this is very tough in home care, is to turn off their TV because they're consuming a huge amount of subliminal programming and entrainment and sort of disinformation that makes it even more difficult. And I find in many circumstances TV makes people much angrier. So if they can find ways of being entertained without being dependent on the TV, it would be fantastic.
Yeah, I have definitely seen them becoming more angry with what's going on TV. So that does seem very true. Well, thank you.
Catherine, this is Plain. Now we're talking about technology a bit. So do you see any new energy technologies, such as the new electrics of the web bots, coming onto the scene soon? And have you looked into Andrea Rossi's ECAT, for example?
I haven't. And it's funny, I was just meeting with a group of scientists who are very up on the latest energy technology. And last year I was in a wonderful conference in Switzerland that had energy technologists from around the world. And what they were showing and telling us about was quite dazzling. There's no doubt that there's tremendous pressure to bring this stuff online now. And one of the things I watch all the time, because something that, if there's anything that will have a dramatic impact on the pricings in the financial and precious metals market, it's the introduction of this kind of technology. It can sort of change everything and change all the prices and all the relative values in very dramatic ways. So I watched a lot, and there are many indications that would tell me they're looking to flip the model, but I still think it's a little too early to tell. And certainly it's getting harder and harder to control this stuff, and more people are just realizing that there's a lot that can happen. So I think I would say probably, but I still think we don't know. But I will tell you as an investment advisor, there's nothing more important to track than this. So we'll see.
Well, it certainly looks like the ECAT is getting some big name, big money support. And they're intimating that they might be willing to just focus on large institutions and kind of, make it for power generation and things like that, and then not allow us to have it in our house. So that's one possibility.
Well, right. One of the things I'm concerned about is whether the smart grids are designed to, basically keep them charging us a lot for energy while they implement this technology, but it's flowing through the old footprint. So I don't know, but I commend your effort to figure it out, because I would love to be able to figure out what's going on. But I don't see, I'm looking through the glass darkly, and I don't see a clear picture emerging yet.
Well, a related technological question is, what do you think of the open fabrication movement as represented by Neil Gershenfeld at MIT? This would seem to lead to an almost unstoppable decentralization.
I hope it works.
It's pretty far along, actually, around the world. I mean, little girls in Africa making computer chips and things. I mean, and a cheap version of it only costs about $20,000 to make anything.
Yeah, I think what's going to explode on the scene from new technology is quite exciting, and different processes of managing it. I don't know if you just saw the latest. there's a video that went around last month about a Xerox machine that can make a tool. So you put a tool in one side, and using plastic composites, it just makes a duplicate of the tool on the other side. So you can literally Xerox a wrench.
Well, that's
amazing.
an example of what I'm talking about. It's really quite far along now.
Yes. So, and I think the question is, how do you integrate this kind of stuff in a way that preserves general well-being? How do you do that? Because it's possible to do it in a way that just, puts millions of people out of work and they sink into poverty. So, one of probably the most depressing book I've ever read in the last decade was Kurzweil's The Singularity is Near, because he basically says, okay, the machines are going to be in charge. They're going to run everything. The humans are literally going to lose control of the machines.
Well, he's a representative of that school of thought, but fortunately, a lot of folks are, pretty strongly opposed. And when you see in the real world where some of this stuff is being used today as we speak in poor countries, it's quite liberating for the masses. It's not corporate. It's not corporate. Right.
Well, I think there's a lot of great stuff going on, particularly in the emerging markets, because, the poverty that we've seen around rebalancing the economy, there's a lot to be said for doing that. When you have the first world sitting in luxury and everybody else literally living on the edge in real poverty, that's not such a pretty scene. So the idea of rebalancing has a lot of attractions. So there's a lot of good stuff going on. I don't want to underestimate that.
By the way, are there any technologies that you personally have either worked with or you're familiar with that you see as really offering some good potential for the future for Mrs. Local?
I hate to sound like this, but I keep coming back to prayer, because the technology that we most need, what a great currency does, a great currency facilitates honest and clear communication, so that 6 billion people can make choices. I can decide to buy this pair because 6 billion people minus one give me a clear indication of value in the price expressed to me in a currency. So a currency is a great communication tool. And I think that one of the challenges we have is with all the manipulation of the financial system and using the financial system as a battleground, is we've lost our ability to communicate with each other. And I think that prayer and meditation is one of the best ways I know, other than a great currency and a great financial system, to communicate with each other and to sort of reach a consensus. And I've been very interested in the examples I've seen of where communities practice community meditation or prayer and some of the results that they've gotten. One of the things that most concerns me about the cellular technology and some of the other wireless technology is I think that we're swarm animals and we resonate with each other, and I think it interferes and manipulates and prevents some of that resonation is my concern. And so anything that helps us improve that communication without the sort of the powers that be getting in the middle of it. In theory, I would love social media and all sorts of cell texting. If you look at how it's being used, though, I think it's fairly. If you look at the backdrop, there's something quite evil behind it. So, the technology that I have the most enthusiasm right now for is an ancient one, and that's the power of really developing our mental and spiritual capacity in a way that really serves to build up our power and intelligence. And that's one of the reasons that I so enjoy Cliff's work, because I think he's trying to help facilitate that. He's trying to help us, because the media is so distorted and so many of the communication tools are so distorted. One of the reasons I find his work so valuable is it gives me an insight into the sort of psychic storm that can help me make sure that what I resonate with is making sense.
Well, that's a really good thing. That's the way to look at it. Maybe it's like the 100th monkey for meditation or something.
Right.
How we can put it all out. I even know somebody studying Sanskrit to try to learn more about
really?
Ancient cities that they wrote about. Yeah, the cities, I don't know, like 50 or so psychic kind of skills that they thought that everyone had. And, of course, it's now very hard to figure out in modern writing what it really meant. But it just shows that there's so much potential. I mean, even just rediscovering what's been lost.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the things that Mr. Global is very afraid of is the field. Because when people
what
reach
field?
consensus, do you know, have you ever read Lynn McTaggart's The Field or any Rupert Sheldrake on morphogenic fields?
Sure, Sheldrake's books.
Right. So the notion that we share intelligence, what you'll find is at the top, people get very concerned that a group of people will reach consensus, get a lock on something, sort of decide in the field, and then it's impossible to get them to move and be manipulated. They do really understand the power of what happens when a large group of people start to resonate together. And I think a lot of their investment in social media and things like that is to make sure that they're on the inside of that and can control it and influence and understand it.
Precisely. Okay, moving on. Now I'll pass it over to Groundrod.
Yeah, Catherine, I really resonate with what you're saying, prayer and meditation, and I want to get excited about the new electrics and new technologies, but I really think everyone's going to have to spend 3 hours in the garden weeding and watering. And on to my next question. Catherine, you've stated how most of your life you thought of yourself as an insider and then fell from grace as an outcast, only to become a beacon of hope and inspiration to millions of souls such as us on the forum, listeners to Coast, and many truth-seeker information outlets. Where do you see yourself now, and could you tell us about your new service partnership with sealaneadvisory.com?
Well, sure. All my life I had this dream of somehow getting to be free of the beast, and I did it in probably the worst way, which is the beast just threw me overboard. And so, one of the big questions was, could you find a way? I used to work for large corporations and large government agencies, so could I find a way to be self-sustaining outside of that world, just working for individuals? And so what happened was, when I started to do radio shows, people came to me and started to ask me to help them with their investments. And so I started to do that on a de minimis basis in 2004, and then registered Solari Advisors in 2007, and then had been working as an investment advisor but not managing money, and then started a money management operation, Sealane Advisory. We launched and started managing money in April. So now we're doing that, and I think where I see myself going, what is most in my heart to do, the hardest thing when you go through the kind of process I went through in my squabble with the federal government, you wake up every morning and you literally have to decide, do I want to stay alive today? And because it's so rough. And so one of the things you decide, well, if I want to stay alive, what do I want to stay alive to do? And what I decided I wanted to stay alive to do was basically help re-engineer the investment model to something in which literally you could build alignment between the different parts of society, and you could basically build an investment model where millions and millions of investors could make money healing the environment and reducing consumption and integrating new technology. I call it the Solari model. If you go to the blog and do a search for the Solari model, you can pick up, more than you ever wanted to know about the whole thing. But in essence, what I believe is that if we took the investment model that most institutional investors and investment advisors used and said, okay, look, any investment has a total economic return, which is its pro forma impact on the whole financial and environmental ecosystem. And that total economic return divides into a return to the investor and a return to the network. So total economic return is return to investor, return to the network. And basically the Solari model says, number one, take the time to understand the impact on the ecosystem. So, I invest in a company, but I understand how that company adds value or deletes value in the wider ecosystem. And, step two says use that information to identify opportunities and protect yourself against risks, but in a way that improves your performance on return to investment. And I found over long periods of time the system absolutely works because you avoid putting money in things that ultimately are not sustainable. So, under my system, you never put money in Enron because it's a bunch of hoo-has and they're doing very destructive things. Because ultimately, if enterprises that are destroying total economic value, ultimately, that comes back to haunt some, if not all, of the investors. Okay, so finally, what the model just changes one thing from the traditional investment other than just being cognizant of the overall total economic return, and that is that it says never intentionally do anything to improve your return to investor that intentionally deletes total economic return. Now, if you just made these few small changes to the investment model, in fact, what you would have is you'd have, instead of having pension funds, throughout the 90s we had pension funds who were investing in prison stocks and in Fannie Mae, and that was basically an insane decision because if the prison stock succeeded, then Fannie Mae would have to fail. You can't take a neighborhood of 100,000 people and have them all in prison but refinancing and their home from prison. In other words, if they're not free and generating an income, the value of real estate in that neighborhood will not go up. And so, if you look at our pension funds and our retirement savings, they were guilty of significant multiple personality disorder because they're literally financing the banks, moving all the jobs abroad. At the same time, they're buying housing paper in the housing bubble that is going to be worthless once they finish moving all those jobs abroad. So there was a serious refusal to look at the total financial ecosystem and compute that into your investment strategy. And as a result, we financed Mr. Global's party and a lot of community parties, but we've siphoned off and wasted and destroyed billions, if not trillions of dollars of baby boomer retirement savings. And that was a failure of governance and a failure of basically the investment model. So that's kind of what I do now. Day to day, what I try and do is apply that model to protect families, because my feeling is if I can help a group of subscribers and clients navigate this society and this situation and figure out how to make it through the gauntlet despite it, the more people who can do that, the greater immunity it can build, the more we can shift things. And if we can shift enough power and money, then we can start to try and realign to something that's much more win-win. Right now, you have a win-lose relationship between, the interests of people in a community and the Dow Jones. And that the only way that can end is in significant depopulation. So the question is, can we realign the investment model so that people, so that labor and capital can figure out a way to create more wealth aligning with each other instead of having a win-lose relationship. And so that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in helping individual families, whether it's subscribers or clients, do that and to see if something can emerge which can help contribute on a larger scale. So that's kind of my day-to-day focus.
It's kind of asymmetrically throwing within the current system, huh?
Well, we all live in the matrix. There is no way, in my opinion, unless we really want to go out to the most remote areas and, kind of...
Or off planet, yeah.
Right.
So, you can't escape the reality of our global network and existence, right?
Right. So, if you look at I don't know if anybody's ever listened to, I have an audio seminar recorded in 2008 called Position Your Assets for Growth in Uncertain Times. And, one of the things, I organize a portfolio of assets into global and local and liquid and non-liquid. And I like to have, most people come to me and they've got everything in global liquid. And I try and say, well, wait a minute, let's get this balance between global and local, and let's get it balanced between liquid and non-liquid, and let's get it really diversified by place. I'm a great believer in never have anything in one place. I mean, you can say local's wonderful, but if you lived in New Orleans and had everything in New Orleans, you got wiped. So I am a great believer in sort of geographical balance. But I do think that there is no way, because the forces that we're dealing with are truly global, and the centralization is greater in some places than other. Particularly, the more invasive the technology is, the worse it is. But if you look at what they're rolling out, it's a global plan. And so if we're going to shift things, it has to be shifted globally, and it has to start with consciousness.
Yeah. I guess part of my question was wondering how those of us with, living paycheck to paycheck, the general public could invest with you and your ideas, and I guess it's through learning. Would that be?
Sure. It's, you can listen to the Solari Report. So I'm posting pretty much every day on the blog, but we do it precious metals once a month on the Solari Report. And
right.
We're talking about sort of investment issues. I'm not giving investment strategy or advice through the Solari Report. I'm pretty strict about not doing that. And then I provide consultations and consulting services through Solari Advisors. So I work with people from the people who are very, very modest to people who are extremely wealthy. I have probably the widest spread in terms of net worth, because I'm interested in seeing everybody across the spectrum and being successful and trying to figure out how to help everybody do it. And then on C-Lane has a minimum account of $250,000. And so if you don't have $250,000, we don't like to take more than 50% of your assets. So if you don't have a net worth in liquid assets of $500,000, one thing you can do is we post quarterly our top 10 holdings. So if you look at the model portfolio page and you look at our model portfolio fact sheet, if you want to see what we're up to on the security side, you can certainly see that. But
great.
But one thing, if you're interested in precious metals, I would think following along with the precious metals market report and what we're doing in the Solari Report with precious metals would be a great way to start building savings.
Yeah, I was wondering what happened to Solari gold and silver sales.
What we found was we really liked doing it, but there wasn't enough volume to really warrant doing it without getting into markets which we didn't want to go into, or dealing with people that we didn't want to deal with. It was a lot easier to just, we were doing it in partnership with a money changer. And one of the reasons we started it was we had a couple of periods where it was literally impossible to get through to them. and I was really worried that my clients couldn't get service. And what we generally found was it was easier to just send people to the money changer and then help them on the consulting side do it. And so the business economics just didn't work for us. It just wasn't enough profit in it to do it. It's a very low margin business.
Sure.
So.
Great. Thank you, Catherine, very much.
Catherine, we're going to shift over and talk about future events, if that's okay with you. In your previous interviews, podcasts, and on your blog, you communicate about relocalization or relocalizing as one of the best solutions ordinary people can take in their daily activities to counter the effects of the neo-corporatists, Mr. Big, Mr. Global, if you will, and general big business dominance of the economy. Are you seeing much of this in your travels? Is there community building going on as you've been about, or is Wally World still where most people are finding their solution to decreasing purchasing power of their money due to the household budget constraints?
I think the results are very mixed because I do think, all political power is place-based, or pretty much place-based, and certainly in the United States, Mr. Global kind of has a lockdown county by county. That's how he built a lot of his power is bottom up. So you have a lot of lockdown, but I do think that what I've seen is you have a lot more interest in what's going on locally. You have a lot more effective action being taken, and where you get enough of a critical mass, you really get some things done. So I think that local organization, local action can make enormous difference to quality of life on the ground. And the question is, where can you get a critical mass of people, particularly who understand what's going on? Because if they don't understand what's going on, then they can easily get tricked. And what I've seen is a lot of good things get started, but a lot of people get tricked. So I would say it's kind of, it's mixed results so far. But the reality is, the global economy, think of the global economy as the body, and the household and community economy is really the molecule. And for the body to be healthy, the molecules have to be healthy. So the way you build a body is one molecule at a time. So we need to be about both. But the building block is certainly the household and the community. And it's interesting, if you look at many of the people who are interested in building community, what they often don't understand is the thing that makes a successful community are successful families. I've never been in a community anywhere in the world where the success of local economy didn't come down to a series of families who built enterprise and built people and built civic participation and contributed lots of time and money to sort of building the commons. And so if we want to build successful community, we're going to have to be in the business of helping families succeed. And right now, most of the families I know, literally globally, are struggling with so much. It's one thing to build and operate a great business in a community. It's another thing to do when somebody is playing games with your taxes and spraying chemtrails on your head and debasing your currency.
Definitely, yeah. Makes things much tougher when the community isn't there to support the family and the individual, and without community there and without the families in the community, you don't have that mutual support network.
Right. Now, if you come, I live in the South in the United States. If you come into most small towns in America, there are essentially three power bases. You have the courthouse, you have the bank, and you have the church. And the church is a complex, there are lots of different kinds of churches, but you still have within the church some organizations which are committed to helping people succeed, and much more so than necessarily the bank and the courthouse. So, there are still pockets within communities. What's amazing is I did a Solari report with Dr. Gwen Scott, who's a naturopath, who's an expert on how to reverse the sort of the negative impacts of chemtrails on your health. And she said, we had 10 actions you can take to protect yourself from chemtrails. And she said the number one action you can take is to appreciate the miracle, because if you look at all the things that have been sprayed on our heads, we should all be dead. And the fact that we're not says that something is really going on.
Yeah.
Right. So what is that something? And what's amazing to me is I'm amazed throughout America the communities still work. And the reason they work is the vast majority of people get up and do everything in their power all day long to try and make them work. And what's amazing is how they've managed to do that despite the headwinds and the trials and tribulations and problems. It's quite remarkable. But there is this thing called grace in the universe that is really operating, because we should all be dead, but we're not.
Very glad that we're not. And certainly grace must have some role to play given everything that's been thrown at us. I have kind of a separate question for you from Suzanne Toro. If you know of resources, and part of making things work in community is to establish those local financial systems that you've talked about, where Joan and Ann can go and sit with their local banker who doesn't want to write a loan for Mr. Smith, but Joan and Ann are willing to lend the money if the banker will play the middleman. Are there systems that you are aware of that can help local communities to set up their financial systems so that the local communities can unplug from the beast and work direct with other communities, members in their communities, and cross communities within larger regions?
We're going to have to do it through personal networks. So one of the reasons I've encouraged people to do Solari circles is, they're small, they're informal, and it's almost a knowledge management tool. But that way, if everybody can organize into very small groups of people they trust, then you don't have to trust everybody else to do an occasional deal with them. And that's the building block of starting to do financial transactions. But we need little cells of people who trust each other, who are then organized to transact with other cells. Now that has never come together, and one of the reasons is most people think they can continue to use the, sort of the banking platform. Now, I don't know a way of organizing it other than through personal networks of trust.
Okay.
And, most people feel, one, that they can't trust other people to be honorable in financial transactions, and two, that if they pull their money out of the mainstream system, that will somehow make them a target.
Do you think possibly that more actively promoting the local credit union is a first step in transitioning away from the Wall Street model to a more
Absolutely.
traditional local model before then making that final step even further if that's the way things need to go?
Absolutely. So getting into a local bank and getting to know the local financial people who you can really trust is absolutely the first step. And then the second step is saying, well, where can I put my money that gives me true diversification so it's not all sitting in a brokerage account? So, for example, one of the things you'll see, I have family members who said, well, I want true diversification, so I'm going to do the local, not only do I bank at the local credit union or bank, but I'm going to put money in the local community loan fund. And that's true diversification outside of the sort of traditional brokerage system.
Sure.
The other thing is, for people who've been successful, whose investments have done well over the last, I have a book called Gifting to the Children We Love, and there is so much that families can do within families to help each other with gifting or money. There's a wonderful book, and I interviewed the author on the Solari report. It's called Building Family Wealth with Jay Hughes. Let me get the exact title. And there's a lot that families do to organize and manage wealth. And it's not just what a family can do. It's or a wealthy family can do. It's called Family Wealth, Keeping It in the Family. And if you go to the Solari blog, just do a search for Family Wealth, you'll pick it up. He talks a lot about what are the behaviors and habits that cause a family to be financially successful together. And, of course, you see it when the immigrant groups come into the United States. They're fantastic about, sort of organizing and managing economic conspiracy together as a family, and they build tremendous wealth and equity over time by doing that. So a lot of this comes down to good habits and behaviors where families get smart about money and make each other smart about money and then go to work to build, whether it's enterprises or investments or whatever. There's a lot of that we don't do. We've all been trained to just put our money in the big bank or the big brokerage system and strip our families. And so I talked before about the different generations getting together. Yeah. Part of what needs to happen is the different generations need to get together in a family and literally say, okay, we need to conspire. Mr. Global is out there trying to debase us and steal our money. How can we conspire together to make sure Mr. Global can? And not only that, we reverse it, because true decentralization means Mr. Global gets drained and millions of families on the ground build new wealth.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. And I like how, in what you've been talking about, it shifts away from a debt model to an equity model. A question that I always had about that was, if you've got a multi-generational approach and there is equity investment inside the community, if there is some need for liquidity, how do you get the equity out of these investments, long-term diversification investments that you've put together?
Right, and that's always been the argument for creating a community venture fund.
Thank you.
If you could create a community venture fund that's publicly traded, then the investments in the individual companies can stay illiquid and professionally managed. But everybody in the community could publicly trade the stock and put it in their 401k or IRA. If it could be made eligible as long as it could be made eligible even if it's not liquid, but it's better if it's liquid.
Yes.
So there is a way to do it, and in fact, that was one of the things. There were several things I was doing in the 90s that caused me so much political trouble. One was we were building software that would let everybody see all the sources and uses of government money by place in their neighborhood. So all the shenanigans would stop because everybody could see what the shenanigans were. But the second was we were doing community venture funds and literally making a software tool called Community IPO in a box. So, with a bunch of radio dots, you could literally spit out a prospectus that would structure a community venture fund to do just that kind of thing. And then, of course, we were helping to do the HUD loan sales in a way that was kind of power shifting on the ground, who controlled real estate within a place. So, but the venture fund was hugely threatening to Mr. Global because if you want everything to run through your corporate stocks, I go back to Whole Foods. If Whole Foods is trading at a multiple of 34 times, then Whole Foods investors can make a whole lot of money if the Rawsome Food Club in Venice Beach, California gets shut down, because suddenly all those people have to go to Whole Foods, and every dollar of new sales, because it's variable, a lot of that falls to your bottom line. Your stock's trading at 34 times the biggest investor's got a 10% position, and suddenly, it makes a difference to shut down lots of food clubs in terms of what it can do for the stock.
Okay.
So the community venture funds were not appreciated by the guys who are looking to take over communities with franchises.
Yeah, no, it would be something that's very threatening, and anything that tears it away from their centralized control grid and puts it back into community control certainly would be a big threat to them. Thank you very much for those answers.
Hi, Catherine. This is Vito again. I have a question from forum member Disaster Cat. It reads as follows. I understand you have been working with other people in your own region in order to form small communities that will be able to adapt to more localized production and food supply issues that may arise within the next few years. Could you tell us more about what you and others are doing? Also, what do you feel are the most important things for people interested in forming such communities to tackle first? And are there any lessons that you've learned so far that you can pass on to us?
That's an excellent question. We've tried a series of different things here. I live in western Tennessee, and I've tried a series of different things with different groups. And then also, I've worked with two communities in Middle Tennessee and seen various things. I think what I find is most important is that within a community, people are exceptionally conflicted as to whether or not they want to do they want to be on the pro-centralization team or the pro-decentralization team. So, for example, you'll see an activity get going that has a lot of energy, and suddenly, suddenly the people involved will get offered government contracts and government programs, and it kind of kills the energy on anything that's occurring in sort of a natural market. So there's a real effort by the old model to kind of buy people away, or use a variety of positive and negative incentives to kind of bollocks up the effort. And so I think the efforts I've seen really succeed are when you have, it's often a family who are very, very clear that they want nothing to do with government money and government programs or large corporations and big foundations. And they're very clear whatever they do has to be self-sustaining on just a marketplace serving individuals. And where you get that kind of clarity and a commitment to do it, and people go at it over long periods of time, and you kind of keep people out who are really not interested in that model, you get real success. So, for example, if you watch a farmer like Joel Salatin, apparently Salatin told a group over at the farm last year that he has $2 million a year of sales, which, having visited his farm and operation, I can absolutely believe. But, he has a family, and they've been spending decades building, absolutely committed to doing things which are truly entrepreneurial and don't involve government money. He's found many ways of sort of dealing with government that are very effective. But he basically keeps them out of his income statement and his balance sheet. I've seen the same with Franklin Sanders and his farm and family. But again, they were very, very clear. And anytime I've seen a group, we did a financial permaculture conference over in Hohenwald, and basically the operation got pulled apart because between sort of big corporate money and big government money, they kind of showed up and wanted to change things. So I think to be successful, you need to be really, really clear that you want to get off the Titanic and build an ark, but you've got to stay on that ark and stay focused on it. And so how can you build a group of people who are really committed to staying away from government and big corporations and understand you've got to be one or the other? And that, believe it or not, and I've found in America, is much harder to do than you would think.
Well, I believe you. It's we all, to some extent, are part of the matrix. It's hard to cut it off. I now have a question from Jules, and he writes, Solari circles concentrate on funding local communities like a financial action club with people working in groups with the tenet of honesty and trust. With Fukushima and its radiation poisoning, the uncertainty from earth changes, climate, weather, and the potential of global economic collapse, it would seem that Solari circles would be the perfect foundation to start survival groups. I'm curious, are you now taking steps for the collapse of society and living a survivalist mentality, for example, storable food and water, location away from populated areas, and underground shelters from radiation?
No. If you look at the property where where I've been living for the last since 2004, and a community where I've been living from 2000. So I have my own generator, I have gardens, I've been planting orchards, I've spent a great deal of time and effort figuring out a disaster recovery plan. I'm trying to take my ham radio license, so I'm doing a lot of these things, and I think they're very useful. At the same time, I'm much more focused on what I want my contribution to be to build the future, because I think the chances of, I'm not planning on global economic collapse, but I have spent my focus trying to figure out a way to build a successful business that really helps people navigate this environment. And I'm not prepared to try and live a totally self-sufficient existence, because living by myself, I can't do a totally self-sufficient existence and build the business. And as it turns out, one of the things I'm going to need to do for the business is travel extensively. So that's going to put me in a situation where I'm sort of dependent on the goodwill of strangers and the infrastructure working. And, if the global collapse should ever come, good heavens, I have no idea whether I'll be in Singapore or London or, in the wilds of Montana. But I'm not, my expectation is we're going to continue to have slow burn with all sorts of local collapses and warfare and problems like that. So I don't see myself building a survivalist lifestyle, and frankly, I'm much more interested in thriving than in surviving. I'm not very interested in surviving. My vision of the world is an abundant vision, and I don't think that that the survivalist mentality works. So the other thing is I've been through some pretty violent times in my life and dealt with a lot of violence, and one of the things I've discovered is death is not the worst thing that can happen. So I'm a lot more concerned about protecting myself from certain kinds of spiritual scenarios than of protecting myself from physical death.
Well, I think we all share in that. I hope you're right. Thank you for that answer. And now we're going to move on to Green Meadow, who has more related questions for you on this subject.
Okay.
Hi, Catherine.
Hi.
I'm wondering, what is the fate of the middle class in all of this? Dmitry Orlov thinks it's ridiculous to try and take it with you, so to speak, and he thinks that we need to adapt to a new reality. What do you think?
Well, I'm not very good at adapting to poverty. I've been very poor, and I'm not interested in, being poor or staying poor. So, but I do think we need to adapt to a new reality, because everything is shifting. Technology is shifting, the economics are shifting, and so if we're going to live a healthy life or a financially healthy life, we have to shift. Now, I think it's very important to understand that there is a group of people centralizing power and money and doing it in a way that's hugely destructive of everything and everyone, including us. So, so we are engaged in a game of spiritual and economic warfare, and it is important to be flexible. So I think Orlov makes some good points, but I think our greater risk is getting tangled up in the matrix in a way that is horrifying for our soul, and that's going to be our bigger risk. But I don't think there's any reason why we can't have an abundant life on planet Earth, and I'm for one, I'm prepared to fight for it, as opposed to embrace poverty and think that that's my lot in life.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking it's almost more of a paradigm shift. That
right.
The thinking is the piece that really needs to change. So do you think the middle class needs to change their thinking?
Well, I'm sure they need to change their thinking, because when you take a group of people and, we talked about the red button problem the last time we spoke. when you take a group of people who think that it's okay to go kill people all over the world and steal from them all over the world so that they can live a nice, comfortable, convenient lifestyle without being productive, that is very negative karma, and it puts you off sides with the whole planet. It puts you offside with the divine intelligence, and it certainly, sends up a signal to Mr. Global that he can take you out at any time because you have no real friends and no real power. So I think ethically, the American middle class has put itself in a very bad position.
Okay.
So when we embrace non-sustainability at the expense of others, then don't be surprised if the machinery comes around and eats you.
Yeah. Okay, I think you'll like my next question. People are always asking you, what's our % chance of collapse? I want to turn that around because disaster and opportunity are kind of close cousins. What is our % chance of renaissance in the next 10 years? And what are the pieces we would need to have a renaissance?
Well, I think the chances of renaissance are reasonably good, and I don't know if it's in the next 10 years. I think the question is, can we integrate new or available healthcare and energy technology along with digital technology in a way that doesn't lead to, that leads to freedom and not fascism? And I think the chances of renaissance are greater than the chances of collapse. And, of course, the political question that we sort of got into the last time we spoke was, for the most powerful people on the planet to go along with renaissance, is their formula that we need depopulation first. So they're happy to have renaissance, but they're not happy to have renaissance with 6 billion people who will explode in numbers because the energy cost drops to zero. So I think the chances of renaissance are greater than the chances of collapse. And the big question mark is, to get there, do we have to experience significant depopulation first?
Yeah. Cross our fingers, huh? Thank you.
Catherine, thank you so much. This is McLaren. We really appreciate the time that you've been spending with us this evening. We've just spoken with Catherine Austin Fitz from Solari.com. Thank you for your time tonight, Catherine. We hope you've enjoyed it as much as we did. Otherwise, tough luck. Sorry.
Yes, I've enjoyed it tremendously.
On your website, you introduced Solari Circles with a quote from Mahatma Gandhi. "The only devils in the world are those running around in our own hearts. That is where the battle should be fought." The information you provide have helped many to defeat those devils, empowering them with knowledge. But your greatest gift is the gift of inspiration. Every accomplishment starts with the decision to try, and many have made that decision thanks to you. On behalf of Fox and all of the members of the WebBot Forum, we thank you, Catherine. In our tradition, may you and your family have many pies to come.
You have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.